Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that makes medieval life look like a vacation. The Aztec Empire. Not the romanticised, pyramid-building, chocolate-inventing civilization you learned about in 3rd grade. I'm talking about the real Aztec Empire, where human sacrifice was a daily calendar event, where your diet consisted of corn and more corn, and where the concept of dental hygiene was about as developed as your high school guidance counsellor's career advice. So before you drift off into the land of nightmares, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what ungodly hour it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, probably avoiding sleep for the same reason I'm making this video, existential dread. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let's think about this for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to live in Tenochtitlan? Did the Aztecs actually pull beating hearts out of people's chests? Or was that just propaganda? What did you do if you accidentally bumped into a priest covered in someone else's blood? Could you survive on a diet that made medieval pottage look gourmet? What happened if you couldn't keep up with the mandatory tribute payments? Would you last a day hauling stones up a pyramid in the scorching Mexican sun, or would you collapse halfway through and become the next sacrifice? And here's the real question. If you showed up with your modern sensibilities about personal space, workers' rights, and the sanctity of human life, how long before you either got sacrificed or caused a theological crisis? Congratulations, you've just woken up in Tenochtitlan. The year is 1487. The sun is already brutal. There's a pyramid nearby with some very concerning stains running down its steps. Someone's drumming in the distance, and you have absolutely no idea how you're going to survive the next 24 hours. Welcome to the Aztec Empire, where every day is a test of endurance, faith, and your ability to not ask too many questions. So you've woken up in Tenochtitlan, the crown jewel of the Aztec Empire, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Congratulations. Your bed is a woven mat on a dirt floor that's somehow both too hard and too dusty. There are no pillows. Those are for nobility. And spoiler alert, you're not noble. You're a commoner, a masual, which means your life revolves around growing corn, paying tribute, and trying very hard not to get picked for the next sacrificial ceremony. The air smells like smoke, lake water, and something vaguely organic that you'd rather not identify. Outside, the city is already awake. Canoes are splashing through the canals, market vendors are yelling, priests are chanting on top of the Templo Mayor, and you can already hear drums echoing across the water. It's not peaceful, it's not quiet, and you don't get to hit snooze. Your back hurts immediately. That's not a surprise. You've been sleeping on what's essentially a fancy doormat for your entire life. The mat is woven from reeds or palm fibres, and while it's better than sleeping directly on the dirt, it's not by much. It's like camping, except you never get to go home. This is home, and it's permanent. You try to stretch, but your joints crack like someone snapping dry twigs. You're maybe 25 years old, which in Aztec terms makes you middle-aged. Your knees sound like a percussion instrument. Your shoulder pops every time you lift your arm. And there's a persistent ache in your lower back that's been there so long you've named it. Welcome to life before ergonomic mattresses, physical therapy, or ibuprofen. The room you're in is small. Really small. It's basically one rectangular space with walls made of adobe brick or wattle and daub, a charming mixture of sticks, mud, and prayers that it doesn't collapse during the rainy season. The roof is thatched with grass or reeds, which keeps most of the rain out. Most of it. When it storms, you strategically place clay pots around the room to catch the drips and hope you don't wake up in a puddle. There are no windows. Well, there might be a small opening near the roof for ventilation, but it's not like you can look out and admire the view. The only light comes from the doorway, which is covered by a simple cloth or reed curtain. Privacy is a concept for rich people. You're just trying to keep the mosquitoes out. Speaking of mosquitoes, you've got bites. Everywhere. Your ankles, your arms, the back of your neck. You've been scratching in your sleep, and now you've got fresh scabs to add to your collection. There's no bug spray, no mosquito nets, and definitely no screens on the windows you don't have. The bugs are just part of the deal. You share your living space with them, along with the occasional mouse, lizard or cricket that's made itself at home in the corner. You sit up and your hair is a disaster. Not that anyone cares. You'll tie it back with a strip of cloth, and that's the extent of your morning grooming routine. There's no mirror. Mirrors are for nobles, made from polished obsidian and worth more than everything you own. You have no idea what you actually look like, and honestly, it's probably better that way. Your family's already stirring. Your wife is rekindling the fire in the hearth at the centre of the room, coaxing the embers back to life with dry grass and bits of wood. Your children, anywhere from 2 to 6 of them, depending on how many survived infancy, are starting to wake up, rubbing their eyes and complaining about being hungry. Because of course they're hungry. Everyone's always hungry. Outside, the city hums with activity. Tenochtitlan is massive, home to somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Bigger than London, bigger than Paris. A sprawling metropolis built on a swamp connected by causeways and canals, filled with temples, markets, and more people than you can count. And you're at the bottom of it all, waking up on a mat on a dirt floor, about to start another day of back-breaking labour in the shadow of pyramids stained with blood. Welcome to paradise. Time for breakfast. What's on the menu? Corn, in the form of tortillas, tamales, or a tolo, a thin corn gruel that tastes like liquidized disappointment. If you're exceptionally lucky, maybe there's a bit of chili or beans mixed in. But protein? Forget it. Meat is reserved for nobles and special occasions. You're eating corn because that's what grows here, and the Aztecs have turned it into a religion. Literally. Corn is sacred. It's woven into every myth, every ritual, every meal. The gods made humans out of corn dough, so you'd better be grateful for your morning tortilla, even if it's as dry as the Sahara and has the texture of cardboard. No coffee, no tea, just water from the lake, which you really hope has been boiled, and maybe some cacao if you're rich enough. Spoiler, you're not. So you chew your corn, ignore the fact that your teeth are already grinding down to nubs, and prepare for a day of labour that would make a medieval serf weep. Your wife has been up since before dawn, grinding corn on a metate, a large flat stone with a rolling pin-like stone called a mano. It's back-breaking work. She kneels on the ground, hunched over, grinding dried corn kernels into flour, over and over and over. Her wrists ache. Her shoulders burn. She's been doing this since she was a little girl, and she'll do it until she physically can't anymore. This is how every single tortilla starts. No mills, no shortcuts, just stone, corn, and endless repetitive motion that would make a modern ergonomist weep into their clipboard. The corn was soaked overnight in lime water, not the fruit but actual limestone mixed with water, in a process called nixtamalization. This makes the corn easier to grind and, bonus, add some calcium and niacin to your diet. The Aztecs didn't know the chemistry, but they figured out that treated corn kept them healthier than raw corn. So that's something. It also makes the corn taste slightly chalky, but you're not exactly in a position to complain about flavour profiles. Once the corn is ground into mesa, your wife pats it into flat circles and cooks them on a komel, a flat ceramic griddle heated over the fire. The tortillas puff up slightly, getting those characteristic char marks. They smell fine, not amazing, not terrible, just fine, and you eat them plain because toppings are a luxury. Maybe you dip them in some watery bean paste if you're lucky. Maybe there's a bit of chili to add some heat and pretend you're eating something with flavour. A tole, the corn drink, is even less exciting. It's basically corn flour mixed with water and heated until it's a thin, lukewarm porridge. Some people add a bit of honey or vanilla if they can afford it, but you can't. So it's just wet corn. It's filling in the way that paste is filling. It sits in your stomach like a small, dense brick and keeps you from being hungry for a few hours. That's its entire job, and it does it without any joy whatsoever. Now, if you were a noble, your breakfast would be a completely different experience. You'd have multiple types of tamales, some filled with turkey or dog meat, others with chili and vegetables, wrapped in corn husks and steamed to perfection. You'd drink thick, frothy chocolate. Yes, the Aztecs invented hot chocolate, but you don't get any. Mixed with vanilla and chili. You'd eat fresh fruit, honey. Maybe some roasted fish from the lake. You'd sit in a shaded courtyard on a woven mat served by attendants, while musicians played softly in the background. But you're not a noble, you're a commoner, so you get tortillas, the same tortillas you had yesterday, the same tortillas you'll have tomorrow. and the day after that, and every day for the rest of your life. It's like eating beige-flavoured cardboard on an infinite loop. The worst part, you're actually grateful for it. Because corn is life. Without corn, there is no Aztec Empire. Without corn, there is no you. The entire civilization is built on this one crop, and everyone knows it. Children are taught from birth that corn is sacred, that the gods sacrificed themselves to create it, that humans are literally made from corn in the creation myths. To waste corn is to insult the gods. To complain about corn is to question the very foundation of existence. So you chew your dry tortilla, wash it down with your sad corn water, and try not to think about the fact that your teeth are slowly being ground down into smooth nubs from years of eating stone-ground grain. Dental health is not a priority in the Aztec Empire. Survival is, and right now survival tastes like corn. At least it's not raining. Let's talk about cleanliness. Surprisingly, the Aztecs were actually pretty into bathing, way more than medieval Europeans, which isn't saying much, but still. Public bathhouses called temazcali existed, essentially saunas where you'd sweat out your sins and maybe a few parasites. But here's the catch. Bathing was deeply ritualistic. It wasn't just about getting clean. It was about purification, about aligning yourself with the gods. You didn't just hop in for a quick rinse. You sat in a small, dark, steamy room heated by volcanic rocks, while a priest chanted and occasionally whacked you with branches. Fun times. And brushing your teeth? Well, the Aztecs did chew on certain roots and herbs to clean their mouths, which is more than the medieval peasants managed. But there's no toothpaste, no floss, and definitely no dentist. So if a tooth starts rotting, you just live with it until it falls out, or the pain drives you to ask a priest to pull it with a sharpened stone. Either way, you're not smiling much. The temazcali is basically a low stone structure, small enough that you have to crawl in on your hands and knees. Once inside, you're packed in with several other sweaty, naked people in near-total darkness. The heat is intense. Volcanic rocks heated in a fire outside are brought in and doused with water mixed with herbs. Steam fills the tiny space, and within minutes you can't breathe without feeling like your lungs are being steamed from the inside out. It's like a sauna designed by someone who actively hates comfort, but you endure it because this isn't about relaxation. This is about spiritual cleansing. The Aztecs believed that sweat carried away impurities. Physical, yes, but also moral and spiritual. A session in the temazcali could cure illness, prepare you for battle, or cleanse you after childbirth. Women who'd just given birth were required to use the temazcali. Warriors used it before heading off to war. Even the sick were brought here, often too weak to crawl in on their own, because the gods demanded purification through sweat. And those branches the attendant is hitting you with? They're not being sadistic. Well, not entirely. The branches, usually from aromatic plants, are meant to stimulate circulation and help open your pores. But it still feels like you're being ritually beaten in a hot, dark cave, while someone chants prayers you can barely hear over your own wheezing. When you finally crawl out, gasping for air, you're drenched in sweat, and possibly reconsidering your life choices. But you're also considered ritually clean, which is important because the gods are always watching, and they care deeply about whether you've sweated recently. Now let's talk about daily hygiene. You do wash, but it's not with soap. That doesn't exist yet. Instead, you use the root of a plant called Copaxocotl, which produces a lather when rubbed with water. It's natural, it's effective-ish, and it smells vaguely plant-like. You scrub yourself down at the edge of the canal or lake, along with everyone else, because communal bathing is just how it's done. Privacy, once again, is a fantasy. Your hair gets washed maybe once a week, if that. Most people just rinse it with water and hope for the best. Lice are a constant problem. Everyone has them. You spend evenings sitting with family members, picking through each other's hair, crushing the little bugs between your thumbnails. It's social bonding and pest control in one. Quality time, Aztec style. And your teeth. Oh, your poor teeth. You do try to clean them. Chewing on fibrous roots or rubbing them with a cloth does remove some of the gunk. But you're also eating stone-ground corn every single day, which is slowly sanding down your enamel like nature's cruelest sandpaper. By your 30s, your teeth are worn flat. By your 40s, if you make it that far, you're missing several. Toothaches are just part of life. You deal with them by chewing on coca leaves if you can find them, or by getting absolutely plastered on pulque and hoping you pass out before the pain gets worse. If a tooth becomes obsessed, you're in real trouble. Infection can spread to your jaw, your blood, your brain. People die from bad teeth all the time. Your only option is to find someone, usually a priest or a healer, willing to yank it out with rudimentary tools. No anesthesia. They just grab the tooth with something that looks like primitive pliers and pull. You scream, you bleed. And then you stuff the socket with herbs and pray to the gods that you don't die of sepsis. So yes, the Aztecs bathed more than medieval Europeans. But that's a pretty low bar. You're still living with lice, rotting teeth, and the constant awareness that cleanliness is less about comfort and more about avoiding divine punishment. At least the sweating is free. Now let's get you dressed. And by dressed, I mean wrapped in whatever coarse cotton or maguey fibre you can afford, which isn't much. Commoners wear simple loincloths for men and basic wrap skirts for women. If you're lucky, you get a cloak called a tilmatli, but it's rough, unbleached and probably itchy. Nobles, on the other hand, get to wear elaborately embroidered clothes dyed with cochineal beetles and decorated with feathers. But you're stuck with undyed beige. It's the Aztec equivalent of a name tag that says peasant. Oh, and shoes. Sandals, if you're fortunate. Most commoners just go barefoot, toughening their feet on the stone causeways and dirt paths of the city. And accessories? Forget gold or jade. Those are for the elite. You might get a simple necklace made of shell or clay, but that's about it. Fashion in the Aztec Empire isn't about self-expression. It's about hierarchy. And you, my friend, are at the bottom. Let's start with the basics. If you're a man, you're wearing a maxtlatl, a loincloth that wraps around your hips and between your legs, tied at the waist. That's it. That's your entire outfit on a hot day. It's essentially a long strip of cloth that covers the absolute minimum required by law and social decency. On cooler days, or when you're doing something that requires a bit more dignity, you add your tilmatli, which is basically a rectangular piece of cloth you drape over one shoulder and tie at the opposite hip. It's like wearing a towel to work, except the towel is scratchy, weighs about 5 pounds when it gets wet, and smells permanently of smoke and sweat. If you're a woman, you're wearing a cuitl, a wrap skirt that goes from your waist to your ankles. It's held up by a woven belt, and if you're doing physical labour, which you are, it rides up constantly and you spend half your day yanking it back into place. On top you wear a wupil, a sleeveless tunic that's essentially a rectangle of cloth with a hole cut out for your head. It hangs loose, which is good for ventilation in the heat but also means it catches on everything. Branches, door frames, your own elbows. It's a daily struggle. The fabric itself is rough. Cotton is available, but the good stuff goes to the nobles. You're wearing maguey fibre, made from the agave plant, which is coarse, stiff, and scratches your skin like burlap. It softens slightly after months of wear and washing, but slightly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. You're basically wearing a wearable cactus. And here's the thing, you can't just decide to upgrade your wardrobe. Sumptuary laws, actual legal codes, dictate exactly what you're allowed to wear based on your social class. Commoners are forbidden from wearing cotton that extends below the knee. You can't wear bright colours. You absolutely cannot wear feathers, which are reserved exclusively for nobility and warriors who've distinguished themselves in battle. If you're caught wearing a feathered headdress or a cloak that's too long or too colourful, you're not just fashion-forward, you're a criminal. The punishment? Public humiliation, beating, or in extreme cases, execution. Yes, you can be killed for wearing the wrong outfit. Footwear is similarly regulated. Nobles wear cactli, sandals made from leather or woven fibres, sometimes decorated with intricate designs. You, as a commoner, can technically wear sandals, but only simple ones. Most people just go barefoot because sandals are expensive and wear out quickly on the stone streets and causeways of Tenochtitlan. So your feet are calloused, cracked, and perpetually dirty. You can identify a commoner from 50 paces just by looking at their feet, or lack of footwear. Jewellery is another marker of status. Nobles drape themselves in jade, gold, turquoise and obsidian. They wear elaborate ear spools, large cylindrical ornaments that stretch their earlobes, and nose plugs, lip plugs, all made from precious materials. You might have a simple clay bead necklace or a bracelet made from woven plant fibres. If you're really fancy, maybe a shell pendant. But that's it. Anything more, and you're breaking the law. Your hair is another status indicator. Commoners wear it long and simple. Men often tie it back in a basic knot. Women braid it or leave it loose. Nobles have elaborate hairstyles, sometimes incorporating false hairpieces, adorned with ribbons, feathers, and ornaments. Warriors who've captured prisoners in battle get to wear their hair in a topknot, a visible symbol of their achievements. But you haven't captured anyone. You've barely left Tenochtitlan. So your hair is plain, practical, and usually covered in dust. Getting dressed in the morning takes about 30 seconds. You wrap your cloth, tie it in place, and that's it. No decisions, no options, no personal style. Your clothes announce to everyone exactly who you are and where you belong in the social hierarchy. And that place is firmly, undeniably, at the bottom. At least the dress code is simple. Time to work. And in the Aztec Empire, work means hard labour. Whether you're a farmer, a labourer, or a craftsman, your day is going to be long, hot, and utterly exhausting. If you're a farmer, you're out in the chinampas, the floating gardens that made Tenochtitlan's agriculture possible. These were ingenious rectangular plots built on the lake, where you grew corn, beans, squash, and chilies. Sounds idyllic, right? Wrong. You're hauling mud, weeding crops, and constantly maintaining the borders so your garden doesn't just float away. And the sun? Relentless. If you're a labourer, you're probably hauling stones for yet another temple expansion or repairing one of the massive causeways that connect the island city to the mainland. No cranes, no wheelbarrows. Just you, your back, and a very heavy rock. And if you're a craftsman, maybe a potter or a weaver, you're working from dawn to dusk in a cramped workshop, producing goods that will be sold in the market or paid as tribute. There's no overtime, no breaks, no workers' rights. Just work until you drop, then wake up and do it again. Let's start with the chinampas because they're genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint. Less impressive when you're the one maintaining them. These floating gardens aren't actually floating. They're rectangular plots of land built up from the lake bed using layers of mud, decaying vegetation, and held in place by willow trees planted along the edges. The roots anchor everything, and the result is incredibly fertile farmland that can produce multiple harvests per year. It's brilliant. It's also constant work. You wade into the shallow water at dawn, mud squelching between your toes, and start dredging more nutrient-rich muck from the bottom of the lake to add to your chinampa. This mud is heavy, waterlogged, and smells like decomposition, because that's exactly what it is. You scoop it up with your hands or a wooden tool, haul it onto your plot and spread it evenly. Your back screams, your arms burn, and you're not even close to done. Next comes weeding. Corn doesn't grow itself, and neither do beans or squash. You're on your hands and knees in the blazing sun, pulling unwanted plants, checking for pests, making sure your carefully maintained irrigation channels aren't clogged. The mosquitoes are relentless, the heat is suffocating, and if you don't stay on top of it, your crops fail. And if your crops fail, you can't pay tribute. And if you can't pay tribute, well, let's just say the authorities are not understanding about missed deadlines. Oh, and those willow trees holding your chinampa together, they need maintenance too. If the roots die or the structure weakens, your entire plot can literally fall apart and drift away into the lake. So you're constantly monitoring, replanting, reinforcing. It's like being a farmer and a civil engineer at the same time, except you have no training and your only tools are sticks and determination. If you're not a farmer, maybe you're a telamim, a porter. The Aztec Empire has no pack animals, no horses, no oxen, no donkeys. Everything, and I mean everything, is carried on the backs of human beings. You strap a leather band across your forehead, attach it to a wooden frame on your back, and load up with goods. Sometimes it's food, sometimes it's tribute payments, sometimes it's massive stones for construction projects. The weight can reach over 50 pounds, and you're expected to carry it for miles, often along narrow causeways or up steep temple steps. Your neck develops permanent calluses from the forehead strap. Your spine compresses. Your knees give out years before they should. But you keep going, because if you stop, you don't eat. Simple as that. There's no workers' compensation, no disability benefits, no retirement plan. You work until your body breaks down, and then you hope your children can support you. If they can't, well, you've had a good run. Craftsmen have it slightly better. At least they're not hauling rocks, but their lives are no less demanding. If you're a potter, you're working with clay all day, shaping vessels by hand on a primitive wheel, or just coiling the clay into shape. Your hands are perpetually raw. If you're a weaver, you're sitting at a backstrap loom for hours, creating textiles that will be sold or given as tribute. The repetitive motion destroys your shoulders and wrists, and the standards are high. If your work isn't good enough, it won't sell, or worse, it'll be rejected as tribute and you'll be penalised. Feather workers have one of the most prestigious crafts. They create the elaborate feather mosaics and headdresses for nobility, but it requires incredible skill, patience and access to rare materials. One mistake, and you've wasted a Quetzal feather worth more than you'll earn in a month. The pressure is immense, and all of this happens 6 days a week, from sunrise to sunset. There's no concept of a weekend. Sunday doesn't exist yet. You work, you eat, you sleep, and you do it all over again. The only breaks come during religious festivals, and even then, you're expected to participate in ceremonies, not relax. The Aztec Empire was built on your back, literally. Every pyramid, every causeway, every full market stall, every piece of tribute sent to Tenochtitlan, it all depended on endless back-breaking labour from people like you. And your reward, you get to do it again tomorrow. Let's talk about social hierarchy, because in the Aztec Empire it matters a lot. At the top, you've got the Tlatoni, the emperor, who is essentially a god king. Below him are the nobles, the Pipiltin, who own land, wear fancy clothes, and generally live lives you can only dream about. Then there's you, the Massahualtin, the commoners, who do all the actual work. And below you, the slaves, or Tlacotin, people who sold themselves into servitude to pay off debts, or were captured in war. But here's the thing. The Aztec class system isn't just about wealth. It's about bloodlines, military achievement and religious favour. You can't just work hard and climb the ladder. Social mobility exists, but it's rare and usually requires either extraordinary military success or becoming a merchant wealthy enough to buy your way into the lower nobility. For most people, you're born into your class and you die there. And if you complain too loudly, well, the gods are always hungry. The Tlatoni sits at the absolute pinnacle of Aztec society. He's not just a king. He's chosen by the gods, advised by the gods, and possibly part god himself, depending on who you ask. He lives in a palace so massive it makes European castles look like garden sheds. He eats food prepared by dozens of cooks, served on plates he'll never use twice. He wears cloaks made from the feathers of thousands of tropical birds. He literally never touches the ground. Attendants spread cloths in front of him so his feet remain pure. You will never meet him. You will never even see him up close. And if by some bizarre twist of fate you do encounter him, you'd better prostrate yourself immediately or risk summary execution for disrespect. Below the emperor are the Pipiltin, the hereditary nobility. These people own vast estates, control tribute from entire regions, and have multiple wives. Polygamy is totally fine if you're rich. Their children attend the Kalmakak, the elite schools where they learn poetry, astronomy, law, and military strategy. They wear clothes so elaborate they jingle when they walk, covered in jade, gold, and enough feathers to make a parrot jealous. They don't work. Not really. They manage, they administer, they make decisions. But actual physical labour? That's beneath them. That's what you're for. Then there are the Pochteca, the long-distance merchants. They occupy a weird middle space in Aztec society. Technically, they're commoners, but they're rich commoners, which changes things. They travel to distant lands, trading obsidian, cacao, and jaguar skins for exotic goods, and they return with wealth that would make some nobles jealous. The nobility resents them, but also needs them, because luxury goods don't import themselves. Some Pochteca become wealthy enough to live like nobles. Big houses, multiple wives, fine clothes, but they have to be careful. Flaunt your wealth too openly as a merchant, and you might find yourself accused of insulting the social order. The nobles don't like upstarts. And then there's you, the Massahualtin, the commoners. You are the backbone, the engine, the disposable workforce that keeps the entire empire functioning. You farm the land, often land that technically belongs to your local noble, meaning you're basically a tenant farmer paying rent in the form of a labour and tribute. You have few rights and many obligations. You can't own fancy clothes. You can't eat certain foods. You can't even sit in the presence of a noble without permission. But here's the wild part. You're not entirely stuck. If you're a young man and you're brave, or desperate enough, you can join the military, capture enemies in battle, and you start earning privileges. Capture 4 enemies, and you join the elite warrior societies, the jaguar warriors or the eagle warriors. You get to wear the animal skins and feathers. You get better food rations. You might even get a small plot of land. It's the Aztec equivalent of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Except the bootstraps are soaked in blood and you might die horribly in the process. And then, at the very bottom, are the Tlacotin, slaves. But Aztec slavery is weird. It's not hereditary. Your children are born free even if you're enslaved. You can own property. You can buy your freedom. You might become a slave because you gambled away everything you owned, or because you committed a crime, or because you were captured in war. Some people even sell themselves into slavery voluntarily to escape debt or starvation. It's temporary servitude, not lifelong bondage, unless, of course, you're designated for sacrifice. Then it's very permanent. The class system is reinforced constantly, in every interaction, every law, every public ceremony. When a noble walks by, you lower your eyes. When the emperor's procession passes, you drop to the ground and don't move until it's gone. To look directly at someone above your station is an insult. To speak out of turn is insubordination. To wear the wrong clothes is a crime. And the thing is, most people accept it. This is the order of the universe. The gods made it this way. The nobles are closer to the divine. You are not. And if you try to upset that balance, if you get too ambitious, too loud, too defiant, well, the pyramids always need more blood. The message is clear. Know your place, stay in your lane, and maybe, just maybe, you'll survive long enough to die of natural causes instead of on top of a temple with your heart in someone else's hands. Social mobility, technically possible, realistically unlikely, and always, always dangerous. If you get a break from work, and that's a big if, you might head to the market, the Tianquistli. Tenochtitlan's main market in Tlatelolco was massive, one of the largest in the world at the time. Tens of thousands of people gathered there daily to buy, sell and trade everything imaginable. Food, of course, corn, beans, chilies, tomatoes, cacao, turkey, dog. Yes, dog, and insects. Textiles, pottery, tools made of obsidian, feathers for headdresses, and even slaves. The market was organised with ruthless efficiency. Each type of good had its own section, and judges patrolled to make sure no one was cheating on weights or prices. Get caught scamming? Expect a public beating or worse. But for all its wonders, the market is also a reminder of your place. You can look at the beautiful jade jewellery and the intricate feather cloaks, but you can't afford them. You're here to buy corn and maybe a little salt if you're lucky. The nobles glide through in their finery, while you clutch your meagre handful of cacao beans, the Aztec currency, and hope it's enough to feed your family for another day. The scale of the Tlatelolco market is staggering. Spanish conquistadors who saw it later compared it favourably to markets in Seville and Constantinople. We're talking about 60,000 people on a busy day, all crammed into a massive plaza, buying, selling, haggling, and occasionally getting into fights over prices. The noise is overwhelming. Vendors shouting, musicians playing, children crying, dogs barking, and the general roar of humanity doing commerce. It smells like everything at once. Roasting meat, fresh flowers, human sweat, animal dung, and the earthy scent of dried chilies. Everything is organised by product type, which makes navigation easier but also means you're walking past endless reminders of what you can't afford. There's the jewellery section, where jade beads, gold lip plugs, and turquoise mosaics glitter in the sun. You slow down to look, just look, and a vendor immediately dismisses you with a glance. Your clothes give you away. He knows you're not buying. There's the feather section, where artisans sell elaborate headdresses and feather mosaics that cost more than you'll earn in 10 years. There's the obsidian section, where blades, mirrors, and decorative items are displayed. Obsidian is sharp enough to be used for surgery and weapons, and the really fine pieces are works of art. You can afford a basic scraping tool, maybe. Then there's the food section, which is where you actually belong. Stalls overflow with produce: tomatoes, squash, beans, avocados, chilies in every variety and spice level. There are live turkeys in cages, their gobbling adding to the cacophony. There are baskets of grasshoppers, fried and seasoned with chili, a decent source of protein if you can get past the texture. There are vendors selling tamales, fresh tortillas, atole, and if you're really lucky, a cup of foamy chocolate. But that costs cacao beans, and you don't have many. Cacao beans are the closest thing to currency the Aztecs have. They're small, portable, and universally accepted. A single bean might buy you a tamale. 100 beans could buy a slave. Yes, a slave. The slave market is right there, in its own section, where people stand on platforms to be inspected by potential buyers. Some are prisoners of war. Some sold themselves to escape debt. They stand silently, stripped down so buyers can assess their health and strength. It's brutal, transactional, and completely normalised. You walk past without making eye contact because staring is rude and also because it's deeply uncomfortable to see human beings priced like pottery. The judges, court officials assigned to maintain order, patrol constantly with wooden staffs. They check weights and measures, settle disputes, and dish out immediate punishment for fraud. Cheat someone on the weight of corn you're selling? The judges confiscate your goods and beat you publicly. Try to pass off low-quality obsidian as premium. You're banned from the market and possibly enslaved if the offence is serious enough. There's no appeals process. Justice is swift, public, and painful. Bartering is an art form. You don't just hand over cacao beans and walk away. You negotiate. You complain about quality. You compare prices across stalls. You act offended when the vendor names their initial price. It's theatre, and everyone plays their part. Even when you're buying corn, literally the most common commodity in the empire, you still haggle. Partly because it's expected, partly because every cacao bean counts when you're living hand to mouth. The market also serves as a social hub. People catch up on gossip, share news from other cities, and hear the latest rumours about military campaigns or political intrigue. Travelling merchants, Pochdecker, set up elaborate displays of exotic goods from distant lands. Jaguar pelts, tropical bird feathers, jade from faraway quarries, cacao from the coast. They're the celebrities of the marketplace, drawing crowds with their stories of dangerous journeys and foreign kingdoms. But for you, the market is bittersweet. It's a glimpse into a world of abundance, variety, and luxury that exists just out of reach. You can smell the roasted turkey, you can see the fine textiles, you can hear the laughter of wealthy customers who buy without checking prices. But you're here for corn, salt, and maybe some chilies if you can afford them. You count your cacao beans one more time, make your purchases quickly, and head home. The market will be here tomorrow, full of wonders you'll never own. At least the window shopping is free. Now let's talk about tribute, because in the Aztec Empire everyone pays. The empire was built on a complex tributary system where conquered city-states and provinces were required to send regular payments to Tenochtitlan. These weren't small token gifts. We're talking massive quantities of corn, beans, cotton, cacao, precious metals, feathers, jaguar skins, and sometimes even live warriors for sacrifice. And if you're a commoner in a tributary city, guess who's responsible for producing all that? You. Miss a payment, and the Aztec army shows up. And trust me, you don't want the Aztec army showing up. They don't negotiate. They conquer, burn, and haul people back to Tenochtitlan for sacrifice. Even within the empire, you're expected to contribute labour and goods. It's essentially a perpetual tax system with no refunds, no appeals, and definitely no tax breaks. The entire economy runs on this cycle of tribute and redistribution, which keeps Tenochtitlan wealthy, powerful, and utterly dependent on keeping its neighbours terrified. The tribute system is documented in exhaustive detail in codices, painted manuscripts that list exactly what each province owes and when. The Codex Mendoza, created shortly after the Spanish conquest, shows us the staggering scale. One province might owe 2,000 cotton cloaks, 400 bushels of corn, 20 jaguar skins, 8,000 sheets of paper made from tree bark, and 2 live eagles, every 80 days. Another province owes warrior costumes, precious stones, and a specific number of young men for military service or sacrifice. The lists go on and on, page after page of obligations that must be met or else. If you live in a conquered territory, your entire life revolves around tribute deadlines. Your local nobles organise the collection, but it's your labour that produces everything. You grow the extra corn, you weave the extra textiles. You hunt the jaguars or trap the eagles, risking your life in the process because failing to deliver a live eagle is not an excuse the tribute collectors will accept. And if your region is known for a particular resource, say cacao or precious feathers, you're expected to provide it in quantities that often exceed what seems reasonable or even possible. The tribute collectors are feared figures. They arrive with armed escorts, carrying official documents that list exactly what's owed. They inspect everything. If the corn isn't high quality, they reject it and demand more. If the textiles are poorly woven, same thing. There's no negotiating. No, we had a bad harvest this year, or the jaguars weren't cooperating. The Empire doesn't care about your problems. You owe what you owe, and you'll deliver it or face consequences. Those consequences are severe. A city that fails to pay tribute might face a punitive military raid. Warriors descend, burn fields, destroy homes, and capture people to be sold as slaves or sacrificed. It's a very effective collection method. Most cities pay, even when it means their own people go hungry, because the alternative is worse. But here's the twisted genius of the system. The tribute doesn't just enrich Tenochtitlan, it gets redistributed. The emperor uses it to pay his administrators, reward his generals, fund construction projects, and support the priestly class. Nobles receive tribute payments from their assigned territories. Warriors get bonuses. Even commoners in Tenochtitlan benefit indirectly. The city has well-maintained infrastructure, a functioning market full of goods from across the empire, and enough food stored in government warehouses to prevent famine during bad years. This creates a weird economic dynamic. Tenochtitlan doesn't produce much itself. It's an island city with limited agricultural land. Nearly everything, the food, the textiles, the luxury goods, comes from somewhere else, extracted through tribute. The city is essentially a parasite, but an incredibly efficient one that provides stability, protection, and access to a vast trade network in exchange for submission. And if you're living in Tenochtitlan as a commoner, you're not exempt either. You owe labour tribute, called kotikitl, which means you're required to work on public projects, building temples, repairing causeways, constructing aqueducts, whatever the state needs. You don't get paid. It's just your civic duty, enforced by law. Refuse, and you'll be punished. Maybe enslaved, maybe sacrificed. The empire has options. You also owe a portion of whatever you produce. Farmers give a percentage of their harvest. Craftsmen contribute finished goods. Even fishermen owe a share of their catch. It all flows upward to the local nobles, who pass a portion up to the regional administrators, who send a portion to Tenochtitlan. It's a pyramid scheme, except instead of collapsing, it's held together by military force and religious obligation. The psychological weight of tribute is immense. You're never free from it. Every harvest, every craft project, every day of labour is shadowed by the knowledge that a significant portion doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the empire. You work harder than you should have to, produce more than you need, and still live in poverty because so much is taken. And the cruelest part? The system works. The Aztec Empire thrives. Tenochtitlan becomes one of the largest, wealthiest cities in the world. The tribute flows in like clockwork, feeding the empire's expansion, funding its religious ceremonies, and keeping its population fed and its enemies subdued. You don't benefit, but you pay anyway, because in the Aztec Empire, there's no opting out. There's only compliance or consequences, and the consequences are always fatal. Religion in the Aztec Empire isn't something you do on Sundays. It's everywhere, all the time, embedded in every aspect of life. The Aztecs worshipped a vast pantheon of gods: Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, Tlaloc, the god of rain, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and dozens more. Each god demanded devotion, rituals, and most importantly, blood. The Aztecs believed the universe operated on a delicate cosmic balance. The sun needed to be fed with human blood, or it would stop rising. The gods needed constant offerings, or they would unleash droughts, earthquakes, and famine. This wasn't metaphorical. This was literal theology. So every single day, priests performed rituals. Blood was drawn from tongues, earlobes, and genitals. Yes, genitals, as offerings. And on special occasions, full-blown human sacrifice. You couldn't just ignore religion. It was mandatory. Miss a ceremony, and you're not just being rude. You're endangering the entire cosmos. No pressure. Your day begins and ends with prayer. You wake up, you burn incense, copal resin, which produces thick, fragrant smoke, and you offer prayers to the sun god, Tonatiuh, asking him to rise and begin his daily journey across the sky. You thank him for not letting the universe collapse overnight, because according to Aztec theology, the sun is in a constant battle with darkness, and he needs strength, your strength, via blood offerings, to win every single day. Throughout the day, you're hyper-aware of which gods might be watching. Planting crops, you pray to Tlaloc, the rain god, and maybe Sentiotl, the god of maize. Going to market, quick prayer to Yakatacutli, god of merchants and travellers. Feeling sick. You've probably offended Tezcatlipoca, the capricious god of fate, sorcery and jaguars, who's known for randomly ruining people's lives just to keep things interesting. Every action, every decision is filtered through a religious lens. Did you displease a god? Is this drought punishment for insufficient devotion? Did someone in your family forget a ritual, and now you're all cursed? The priests are everywhere, and they're terrifying. They wear black robes stained with dried blood, their own and others. Their hair is long, matted and unwashed, caked with blood from rituals. They smell like death and incense, and they're incredibly powerful, second only to the emperor in influence. They interpret omens, dictate which days are lucky or unlucky, and perform the sacrifices that keep the universe running. Cross a priest and you've crossed the gods, and crossing the gods is a very bad idea. Personal bloodletting is expected, especially from nobles and priests, but commoners participate too. On certain feast days, you're required to pierce your tongue, earlobe, or, if you're particularly devout or particularly unlucky, your genitals with a maguey thorn or obsidian blade. You draw blood onto paper made from tree bark, then burn it as an offering. The smoke carries your sacrifice to the gods. It's agonizing. Your hands shake. Your vision blurs. But you do it. Because everyone does it. Because refusing would mark you as impious, faithless, dangerous. And then there are the festivals. So many festivals. The Aztec calendar has 18 months of 20 days each, and almost every month has a major religious festival dedicated to a different god. Some festivals are somber, involving fasting and penance. Others are joyous, with music, dancing, feasting, and yes, still sacrifice. During the festival of Toxcatl, a young man chosen to impersonate the god Tezcatlipoca lives like a king for an entire year. Fine clothes, gourmet food, beautiful women, before being sacrificed at the festival's climax. It's an honour, supposedly. The Templo Mayor, the massive twin pyramid dominating Tenochtitlan's central plaza, is the physical and spiritual heart of the empire. One side is dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the other to Tlaloc. Priests ascend its steep steps multiple times daily, performing rituals at the shrines on top. The steps are stained dark with blood. The smell, iron, smoke, decay, hangs heavy in the air. You can see the Templo Mayor from almost anywhere in the city, a constant reminder that the gods are watching, waiting, hungry. Religious education begins in childhood. You're taught the prayers, the myths, the proper way to offer incense, and the terrible consequences of angering the gods. You learn that the universe has been created and destroyed 4 times already. This is the 5th sun, the current era, and it too will end, violently, catastrophically, unless humanity does its part to sustain the gods. It's a theology built on anxiety, a constant low-level dread that if you mess up, if society messes up, everything ends. And the thing is, you believe it, completely. When there's an earthquake, everyone knows it's because the gods are angry. When crops fail, it's because sacrifices were insufficient. When the empire wins a battle, it's because Huitzilopochtli favoured them. There's no separation between natural and supernatural. The gods are active participants in daily life, and their moods determine everything. You don't have the luxury of doubt. Atheism isn't even a concept. The gods are real, the sacrifices are necessary, and your survival, personal and cosmic, depends on keeping them satisfied. So you pray, you bleed, you participate in every ritual, and you hope it's enough. Because if it's not, the sun might not rise tomorrow, and that would be very, very bad for everyone. Let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the heart on the altar. Human sacrifice was a central, unavoidable part of Aztec religion, and it wasn't some rare, once-a-year event. It happened constantly. Prisoners of war, slaves, and sometimes even volunteers were led up the steps of the Templo Mayor, laid on a stone slab, and had their hearts cut out with an obsidian blade while they were still alive. The heart was offered to the gods, and the body was tossed down the pyramid steps. Some estimates suggest tens of thousands of people were sacrificed at major ceremonies. The dedication of the Templo Mayor in 1487? Some sources claim up to 80,000 people, though modern historians think the number was likely lower, but still horrifyingly high. And this wasn't hidden. It was public, theatrical, and meant to be seen. The Spanish conquistadors were horrified, but they also exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Still, even accounting for exaggeration, the scale of sacrifice in the Aztec Empire was unlike anything else in the world. If you were unlucky enough to be chosen, there was no escape. It was considered an honour. Your death would feed the sun and keep the universe running. But let's be honest, you'd probably rather just keep your heart. The mechanics of sacrifice were brutally efficient. The victim, often painted and dressed in ceremonial garb, was led up the steep steps of the pyramid. Sometimes they went willingly, drugged or resigned to their fate. Sometimes they had to be dragged, screaming. Either way, the outcome was the same. At the top, priests, usually 4 of them, grabbed the victim's arms and legs, stretching them backward over a curved sacrificial stone called a tekatl. This forced the chest upward, making the ribs more accessible. The high priest, wielding a razor-sharp obsidian blade, made a diagonal cut just below the ribcage, reached in and ripped out the still-beating heart. The entire process took seconds. The heart was lifted toward the sun or placed in a ceremonial vessel. The body was then pushed or thrown down the pyramid steps, tumbling limply to the bottom, where it was collected and, depending on the ritual, dismembered. And here's where it gets even darker. Sometimes the body parts were distributed. Limbs might be given to the warrior who captured the victim, a kind of trophy and ritual meal. Cannibalism existed in Aztec culture, but it was deeply ritualized, not casual. Eating a piece of a sacrificed warrior was believed to absorb some of their strength and courage. It wasn't about hunger. It was about communion with the divine through flesh, still deeply disturbing, but theologically significant in their worldview. Different gods demanded different types of sacrifice. Huitzilopochtli, the war god, wanted warriors, strong, brave men captured in battle. Tlaloc, the rain god, preferred children. Yes, children. During times of drought, young children were sacrificed to Tlaloc, often in remote mountain shrines. The children were made to cry because their tears were believed to bring rain. It's one of the most haunting aspects of Aztec religion. Parents giving up their children, believing it was necessary to save everyone else from starvation. Totec, the god of agricultural renewal, required a particularly gruesome ritual. Victims were flayed, skinned alive, and priests would wear the skins for 20 days as the flesh rotted, symbolizing the renewal of the earth and crops. Imagine walking through the city and seeing priests wearing decomposing human skin like suits. It wasn't horror, it was piety. For the average person in Tenochtitlan, sacrifice was a constant background reality. You heard the drums from the Templo Mayor, you smelled the smoke, the blood, the incense. You saw the processions of victims led through the streets. You watched the bodies tumble down the pyramid steps. It was normalized, woven into the rhythm of the city. Children grew up witnessing it. It wasn't shocking. It was simply how things were. But what if you were chosen? If you were a prisoner of war, you knew your fate the moment you were captured. Warriors fought to capture, not kill, because live prisoners were more valuable. You'd be held in Tenochtitlan, sometimes for months, fed and cared for, fattened up, really, until your designated festival arrived. Some prisoners were treated well, given privileges, even allowed to fight in gladiatorial combat as a final chance to die with honour. But the outcome was the same. You'd climb those steps. If you were a commoner, you were generally safe, unless you committed a serious crime or were selected for a specific ritual. Volunteers did exist, usually people who believed deeply that their sacrifice would honour their family or guarantee them a place in the paradise of the sun god. They'd be celebrated, mourned, and remembered. But let's be real, most people didn't volunteer. Most people desperately wanted to avoid the altar. The psychological impact is hard to overstate. You lived in a society where the gods were hungry, where your life could be forfeit at any moment if the priest decided the cosmos needed more blood. It created a culture of intense religious devotion mixed with existential fear. You prayed harder, participated in every ritual, bled yourself during ceremonies, because maybe, just maybe, that would keep you off the pyramid and the scale. Even conservative modern estimates suggest thousands of people were sacrificed annually across the empire. Some festivals killed hundreds in a single day. The Templar Mare was essentially a slaughterhouse sanctified by theology. The skulls of victims were displayed on massive racks called zompantli, skull racks, flanking the pyramid. Thousands of skulls, stacked and arranged in neat rows, a macabre monument to devotion and death. The Aztecs didn't see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as heroes, keeping the universe alive through their sacrifices. But for the victims, for the families who lost sons and daughters, for the prisoners dragged up those blood-stained steps, it was terror dressed up as theology. And there was no opting out. War wasn't just common in the Aztec Empire, it was essential. The Aztecs believed they had a divine mandate to expand, to bring more people under their control, and most importantly, to capture prisoners for sacrifice. This led to a unique form of warfare called the Flower Wars, or Xochitlcoatl, ritualized battles between the Aztecs and rival city-states, where the goal wasn't conquest, it was capture. Warriors on both sides would fight to take prisoners who would later be sacrificed. It was war as religious theatre, but the Aztecs also fought regular wars of conquest, expanding their empire across central Mexico. If you were a commoner, you might be conscripted into the army, handed a wooden club studded with obsidian blades called a macuahuitl, and sent off to fight. Glory in battle could elevate your social status. Capture enough enemies, and you might even become a nobleman. But if you got captured, well, we've already covered what happens next. War was the engine that powered the entire empire, economically, politically, and spiritually. Without it, the system would collapse. Let's talk about your weapon, the macuahuitl. It looks like a wooden cricket bat with obsidian blades embedded along the edges. Obsidian is volcanic glass, sharper than modern surgical steel when freshly knapped. A well-placed strike from a macuahuitl can decapitate a horse. The Spanish found this out the hard way. But here's the problem. Obsidian is also brittle. Hit something hard, like another warrior's shield or weapon, and the blades shatter. So you get maybe a few good swings before your weapon becomes a fancy wooden club, and you don't get a backup. You make do, or you pick up a fallen enemy's weapon, or you die. Those are your options. You're also carrying a chimali, a round shield made from wood and animal hide, sometimes decorated with feathers if you've earned any honours. It's your only real defence because you're not wearing armour. Well, not metal armour. If you're lucky and you've proven yourself, you might earn an ichkahuipili, a quilted cotton vest soaked in salt water and dried, which provides surprising protection against arrows and clubs. But most conscripted commoners don't have one. You're fighting in your loincloth and maybe a basic tunic. That's it. You're essentially going into battle wearing pyjamas. Training is minimal for commoners. The military elite, the jaguar and eagle warriors, train for years and wear elaborate costumes made from actual jaguar pelts or eagle feathers with carved wooden helmets. They look terrifying and fight like it. But you got a week-long crash course in hold the weapon like this, try not to die, and for the love of the gods, capture someone. The Aztec military strategy relies heavily on intimidation, numbers, and shock tactics. Warriors scream, beat drums, blow conch shell trumpets, and charge in massive waves designed to overwhelm and terrify the enemy. The goal is always capture, not kill. Dead enemies are useless. You need them alive for sacrifice. So you're supposed to wound, disable, or subdue your opponent, then drag them back to your lines. Easier said than done when they're trying to do the same to you. Warriors often work in pairs or small groups, coordinating to take down a single enemy. And there's a strict hierarchy of value. Capturing a warrior from a powerful city-state is worth more prestige than capturing some random farmer conscript from a minor village. If you manage to capture an enemy, you tie their hands and march them back. Your first captive earns you recognition, a new title, better treatment, maybe a small plot of land. Your second captive, more honours. Your third, you're climbing the social ladder fast. 4 captives and you can join the elite warrior societies, which means better armour, weapons and status. It's the Aztec dream. Fight your way out of poverty, one captured enemy at a time, but the odds are not in your favour. Most commoner conscripts never capture anyone. They survive if they're lucky, and go home with nothing but trauma and maybe a nasty scar. And if you're captured, you're marched back to the enemy city where you'll be held until the next major festival. Then you'll climb the pyramid. Some captured warriors were given the option to fight in gladiatorial combat, tied to a stone platform and armed with a weapon edged with feathers instead of obsidian, facing fully armed jaguar or eagle warriors. It's technically a chance to die honourably in battle rather than on the altar. But let's be honest, it's a rigged game. You're going to die either way. At least this way provides entertainment for the crowd. The Flower Wars were a weird compromise between rival city-states who couldn't afford total warfare but needed prisoners for religious purposes. Both sides would agree on a time and place, show up with armies, and fight ritualised battles. It was like scheduling a deathmatch on Google Calendar. The combat was real. People died, people were captured, but the goal wasn't conquest. It was mutual sacrifice procurement. A theological arms race where everyone lost but the gods supposedly won. Regular wars of conquest were more straightforward. The Aztecs wanted your city, your tribute, and your submission. Resist, and they'd burn your fields, destroy your temples, and haul your population back to Tenochtitlan. Surrender, and you'd become a tributary state, which meant you kept your local leaders but paid tribute and provided warriors when demanded. Most cities chose surrender. The alternative was annihilation. War fed everything. It provided captives for sacrifice, which kept the gods happy. It expanded territory, which increased tribute, which funded more wars. It elevated warriors from poverty to nobility, which incentivized participation. It terrified neighboring states into submission, which stabilized the empire. Remove war from the Aztec system, and the whole thing collapses like a pyramid made of blood-soaked stones, which, metaphorically speaking, is exactly what it was. Believe it or not, the Aztecs had a surprisingly well-developed education system. All children, both boys and girls, were required to attend school. If you were a commoner, you went to the Telpoch-Kali, where boys were trained in basic warfare, agriculture and civic duty. Girls learned weaving, cooking and household management. It wasn't exactly Harvard. The focus was on obedience, hard work and preparing you to serve the empire. If you were noble, you attended the Karmakak, a much more rigorous school where you studied history, astronomy, law, poetry and religious rituals. These schools trained the future priests, administrators and military leaders. But here's the thing. Education wasn't about encouraging critical thinking or personal growth. It was about shaping you into a useful member of society. Step out of line and you'd be beaten. Misbehave repeatedly and you might be expelled, or worse, handed over to the priests. The Aztecs valued discipline, duty and devotion above all else. So yes, they educated their children, but they educated them to obey. Your education begins around age 15, when you leave home and enter the Telpoch-Kali, literally House of Youth. It's attached to the local temple, and it's run by warriors and elder men who've survived enough battles to earn teaching duties. The curriculum is straightforward. Learn to fight, learn to work, learn to respect authority, and learn to never ever question the social order. There are no textbooks, no homework, no parent-teacher conferences, just physical training, manual labour and a lot of being yelled at. The day starts before dawn with cold water baths, yes, mandatory to toughen you up. Then you're sent out to work on community projects, repairing roads, building temples, hauling materials. This isn't volunteer work, it's part of your education. The Aztecs believe that labour builds character, and character builds warriors. You learn to use weapons, the macuahuitl, the atlatl, a spear thrower, the bow and arrow. You practice formations, learn battle cries, and spar with other students. It's brutal. You get hit, you get bruised, you bleed. If you complain, you get hit harder. The teachers aren't there to nurture your self-esteem. They're there to break you down and rebuild you into something useful to the Empire. Evenings are spent learning songs, dances, and religious rituals. Yes, you have to sing. Yes, you have to memorize prayers. And yes, there's a right way and a wrong way to do everything. And the wrong way earns you punishment. Discipline is enforced with wooden paddles, cactus spines, and public humiliation. Forget a prayer, you're beaten. Show up late, you're beaten. Talk back to a teacher, you're beaten and assigned extra labour. The message is clear: conform or suffer. Girls attend a separate section of the Telpoch Kali, or sometimes a temple school where they learn the skills expected of Aztec women. Weaving is paramount. Every woman must know how to weave textiles, because cloth is one of the primary forms of tribute and trade. You learn to use a backstrap loom, which is strapped to your waist on one end and tied to a post on the other. You sit for hours threading fibres, creating patterns, your back and shoulders screaming. You also learn to grind corn, more metate work, to cook, to manage a household, and to raise children. Religious instruction is included: how to make proper offerings, how to pray, how to behave modestly and obediently. The goal is to produce wives and mothers who will support their husbands and raise the next generation of obedient citizens. Now, if you're noble, your experience is radically different. The Karmakak is exclusive, rigorous, and miserable in entirely different ways. Noble children enter as young as 5 or 6, and the discipline is even harsher than the Telpoch Kali. You're expected to achieve excellence, not just competence. You study history by memorizing long oral traditions, the deeds of past emperors, the founding myths, the genealogies of noble families. You learn astronomy and the incredibly complex Aztec calendar system, which requires serious mathematical skills. You study law, philosophy, and poetry. Yes, poetry. The Aztecs had a rich tradition of oral poetry, and nobles were expected to compose and recite verses at public events. But even in the Karmakak, education is about service. You're being trained to administer the empire, lead armies, or serve as a priest. Independent thought is not encouraged. You memorize what you're taught. You internalize the values of duty, sacrifice, and hierarchy. Creativity is acceptable only within strict boundaries. Compose a poem, but make sure it glorifies the gods and the empire. Question the system, and you'll be severely punished, possibly expelled, which for a noble is a devastating loss of status. Religious education is intense. Future priests undergo extreme asceticism, fasting, sleep deprivation, bloodletting, and isolation. They learn to read the Tonalpawali, the 260-day ritual calendar, interpret omens, and perform sacrifices. It's not just intellectual training, it's spiritual and physical endurance testing. Only the most dedicated, or most masochistic, complete it. Punishments in both schools are creative and harsh. Misbehave, and you might be forced to inhale chili smoke. Your eyes water, your throat burns, you cough until you vomit. It's agonizing and humiliating. Repeat offences might earn you cactus spine piercings, or forced labour in the worst conditions. The goal isn't rehabilitation, it's deterrence. And here's the thing, the system works. Aztec society is highly disciplined, hierarchical, and functional. Everyone knows their role. Everyone understands the rules. Education reinforces the social structure from childhood, ensuring that by the time you're an adult, obedience is so deeply ingrained that rebellion feels unthinkable. So yes, the Aztecs educated their children. Universal education centuries before Europe figured it out. But it wasn't about enlightenment or personal fulfillment. It was about creating compliant, productive, expendable parts of a vast imperial machine. And you're just another cog, freshly polished and ready to be used up. Time to talk about marriage. And no, it's not a fairy tale. Marriages in the Aztec Empire were arranged, practical, and often political. Your parents, along with a matchmaker, would choose your spouse based on social standing, economic benefit, and family alliances. Romantic love? That was a nice bonus, but definitely not the point. The wedding ceremony itself was elaborate, involving days of feasting, ritual exchanges of gifts, and a symbolic tying together of the bride and groom's cloaks. Once married, gender roles were strict. Men worked, fought, and participated in public life. Women managed the household, raised children, and wove textiles. Divorce was technically possible, but rare and socially frowned upon. And if you committed adultery? Punishments range from public humiliation to execution, depending on your social class and how much the authorities felt like making an example of you. Marriage wasn't about happiness. It was about duty, lineage, and producing the next generation of workers and warriors for the empire. The process begins long before the wedding. When you reach marriageable age, somewhere between 16 and 20 for men, slightly younger for women, your parents start looking for a suitable match. They consult with extended family, assess which families would make good allies, and evaluate the economic implications. Can this marriage secure better land access? Will it strengthen trade connections? Does it align your family with a more powerful noble house? These are the questions that matter. Your personal feelings about your future spouse are irrelevant. You might not even meet them until the wedding negotiations are underway. Enter the Sihuatlank, the professional matchmaker, usually an older woman with an encyclopedic knowledge of every family in the area. She's paid to broker marriages, and she's very good at it. She approaches the bride's family with a formal proposal, bearing gifts, usually cacao, textiles, or food. The first visit is always refused. It's tradition. The matchmaker returns a second time, refused again. On the third or fourth visit, if the families are actually interested, negotiations begin in earnest. They discuss the dowry, the bride price, the wedding date determined by consulting priests to find an auspicious day on the Tonal Puhuali. Everything is formal, ritualized, and binding. The wedding itself lasts for days. It's one of the few times commoners get to eat well and celebrate publicly. There's feasting, tamales, turkey, maybe even some chocolate if the families can afford it. There's music, dancing, and ritual speeches that go on forever. Elders from both families stand up and give long, flowery orations about duty, respect, and the sacred responsibilities of marriage. You sit there, nodding politely, while your mind wanders to literally anything else. The central ritual is the tying of the cloaks. The bride and groom sit together on a woven mat in front of the hearth, the symbolic centre of the home. A priest or elder takes the groom's tilmatli and the bride's huipil and ties the corners together, literally binding them. This is the moment you're officially married. No, I do. No rings. Just two pieces of clothing knotted together representing the union of two lives, two families, and two sets of obligations you didn't choose. After the ceremony, the bride is carried on the matchmaker's back to the groom's family home. Yes, carried. Like luggage. It's symbolic. The bride is leaving her childhood behind and being delivered to her new life. Once at the groom's home, there's another round of feasting. More speeches, and then everyone finally leaves you alone. The marriage is consummated, and the next morning there's a ritual presentation of the bloodied sheet to prove the bride's virginity. Privacy, once again, is not a thing. Now comes the reality of married life. If you're a man, you continue your work, farming, labouring, crafting, while also taking on the responsibility of providing for a household. If you're a woman, your entire world is now domestic. You wake before dawn to grind corn, make tortillas, weave textiles, raise children, and manage the household. You don't go to the market alone. You don't participate in public ceremonies unless your husband allows it. Your life is circumscribed by walls, children, and endless repetitive labour. Polygamy is legal, but only for nobles and wealthy merchants who can afford multiple wives. If you're a commoner, you get one spouse and you'd better make it work because divorce, while technically allowed, is a nightmare. You need approval from local authorities, and you have to provide legitimate reasons: infertility, abuse, failure to provide, adultery. Even then, divorce brings shame on both families. Divorced women especially face social stigma. They're often seen as failures or troublemakers. Remarriage is possible but difficult. Adultery is a serious crime. If you're caught, the punishment depends on your gender and social class. Men might face enslavement, public beating, or having their heads shaved, a mark of deep shame. Women face harsher penalties: stoning, strangulation, or being paraded through the streets and humiliated. If you're noble, the punishment is often more severe because you're held to a higher standard. If you're a commoner, you might get away with a beating if the cuckolded spouse is feeling merciful. But that's a big if. And children, they come fast and often. There's no birth control. Families with 6, 8, 10 children are common, though many don't survive infancy. Each child is another mouth to feed, another worker for the household, another potential warrior or weaver for the empire. Parenthood isn't about fulfillment. It's about propagation. You raise your children to be obedient, hard-working, and loyal to the gods and the emperor. Anything less is failure. Marriage in the Aztec Empire is a contract enforced by family, society, and religion. It's not about love. It's about survival, duty, and keeping the social order intact. You don't marry for happiness. You marry because it's what's expected, what's required, and what keeps the empire running. Romance, if it happens, is just a lucky accident. Having a baby in the Aztec Empire was terrifying. There were no hospitals, no anesthesia, and definitely no epidurals. Midwives assisted with births, using herbal remedies and prayers to the goddess Tlazolteotl, but complications were common and often fatal. If you survived childbirth, congratulations, you were considered a warrior, equal in honour to a man who died in battle. If you didn't survive, your soul was believed to join the spirits of fallen soldiers in the afterlife. So that's something. Infant mortality was also high. Many children didn't survive their first year. And if your baby was born on an unlucky day according to the Aztec calendar, which was incredibly complex and governed every aspect of life, it was considered a bad omen. Priests might perform rituals to counteract the bad luck, but there was always a shadow hanging over that child. Parenting in the Aztec Empire wasn't just about raising kids. It was about hoping they survived long enough to contribute to the empire. Pregnancy is announced with a mixture of joy and dread. Joy because children are essential, they're future workers, warriors, weavers, and your only real retirement plan. Dread because you know what's coming. You've seen other women go through it. You've heard the screams. You've watched neighbours bury mothers and infants. The odds are not comforting. Throughout pregnancy, you're expected to continue working. Grinding corn, weaving, hauling water, right up until labour begins. There's no maternity leave, no prenatal yoga classes. You just keep going, belly growing, back aching, until your body decides it's time. When labour starts, you send for the midwife, the Tlamatl, a woman who's delivered dozens, maybe hundreds of babies, and has seen every possible outcome, good and catastrophic. The midwife arrives with her tools, herbal preparations, obsidian blades for cutting the umbilical cord, and prayers, lots of prayers. She burns copal incense and invokes Tlazolteotl, the goddess of childbirth, fertility, and also, somewhat ominously, filth and purification. The goddess has a complicated portfolio. The midwife gives you herbal infusions. Tsihuapatli, a plant believed to speed labour, mixed with warm water. It might help, it might do nothing. But you drink it anyway, because what else are you going to do? Labour happens at home, in the same one-room hut where you sleep, cook, and live. You squat or kneel, sometimes supported by a rope hanging from the ceiling. Gravity is your friend here. Lying down isn't really an option. The midwife coaches you, pressing on your abdomen, encouraging you, praying continuously. Other women from your family might be present, offering support or just bearing witness. The men, including your husband, are kept outside. This is women's territory. Women's battle. Hours pass, sometimes many hours. If the baby is positioned wrong, if labour stalls, if something goes wrong internally, your chances plummet. The midwife has limited tools and no real medical knowledge beyond what's been passed down through generations. She might try to manually reposition the baby. She might give you more herbs. She might massage your belly with oil. But if complications are severe, breech birth, hemorrhaging, infection, there's very little she can do. You either make it through, or you don't. If you die in childbirth, you're honoured as a warrior. Your soul doesn't go to Mictlan, the dreary underworld where most people end up. Instead, you ascend to the Western Paradise, where you join the Siwateteo, the spirits of women who died in childbirth. You spend your afterlife accompanying the sun on its daily journey from zenith to sunset. It's a warrior's death, and you're treated with the same reverence as a soldier who fell in battle. Your body might even be guarded after death because there's a belief that your fingers and hair have magical properties, and sorcerers might try to steal them. It's macabre, but it's also a strange kind of honour in a society obsessed with sacrifice and warfare. If you survive, congratulations. You've just endured one of the most dangerous experiences a woman can face. The midwife cuts the umbilical cord with an obsidian blade, ties it off, and buries it, often under the hearth if it's a girl, symbolising her future life centred around the home. If it's a boy, the cord might be buried on a battlefield or given to a warrior to bury, symbolising his future as a fighter. From birth, gender roles are literally carved into the earth. But your work isn't done. Now comes the terrifying part, keeping the baby alive. Infant mortality is staggeringly high. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children don't survive their first year. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, infections. Anything can kill a newborn. You breastfeed exclusively because there's no formula, no alternative. If you can't produce milk, you find a wet nurse or your baby starves. It's that simple and that brutal. Then there's the calendar. Within days of birth, a priest is consulted to determine the baby's tonally, their day sign, based on the 260-day ritual calendar. Some days are incredibly auspicious. Others are cursed. If your baby is born on a bad day, the priest might perform rituals to mitigate the bad luck, or suggest delaying the naming ceremony until a better day arrives. But the shadow remains. That child will carry the weight of their birth date for life, and everyone will know it. Naming ceremonies happen a few days after birth, and involve ritual bathing, prayers, and offerings. The baby is presented to the community, and their name, often referencing gods, animals, or natural phenomena, is announced. It's joyful but tempered by the knowledge that this tiny, fragile life might not last. Parenting is constant vigilance. You watch for signs of illness. You protect your child from accidents, open fires, sharp tools, wandering animals. You teach them prayers and obedience from the moment they can understand language. Because in the Aztec Empire, childhood isn't about innocence or play. It's about survival and preparation. Every child who makes it to adulthood is a small miracle, and you never forget that. Let's say you get sick. What now? Well, you're going to see a healer, or Tisital, who will diagnose you using a combination of observation, astrology, and divine guidance. The Aztecs had an extensive knowledge of herbal medicine. They used plants like cacao, tobacco, and peyote for both medicinal and ritual purposes. Some remedies actually worked. Others, not so much. Broken bone. The healer might set it with splints. Fever? They'd give you herbs and maybe perform a bloodletting ritual to balance your humours. Mysterious illness with no clear cause? Probably a curse. Time to see a priest. The Aztecs believed that illness could be caused by moral failings, angry gods, or sorcery. So treatment often involved both physical remedies and spiritual cleansing. Surgery existed but was primitive. If you needed something cut out, it was done with obsidian blades. Sharp? Yes, but not exactly sterile. And pain relief? Minimal. Maybe some pulque, fermented maguey sap to take the edge off. If you survived whatever ailment you had, great. If not, well, at least your death might feed the gods. The Aztecs actually had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine. They catalogued hundreds of plants with medicinal properties, a knowledge base so impressive that Spanish physicians later studied and documented it. Cacao wasn't just a luxury drink. It was used to treat digestive issues and fatigue. Tobacco wasn't just for smoking. It was applied to wounds and used in poultices. Peyote, the hallucinogenic cactus, was used in religious rituals, but also as a pain reliever. The bark of the ahuehuete tree treated dysentery. The sap of the maguey plant treated infections. Some of this actually worked. Modern science has validated many Aztec herbal remedies. But here's the catch. Aztec medicine was inseparable from religion and superstition. Your illness wasn't just a biological problem. It was a spiritual crisis. Maybe you offended a god. Maybe someone cursed you. Maybe you were born on an unlucky day and this was inevitable. The healer's job was to address all of these possibilities simultaneously. So you'd get herbs, yes, but also prayers, incantations, and possibly a ritual cleansing involving smoke, bloodletting, or a visit to the Temescali to sweat out whatever evil spirits had taken up residence in your body. Diagnosis was part observation, part divination. The healer would examine you, check your pulse, look at your tongue, feel for swelling. But they'd also consult the Tonal Pohwali to see if your illness aligned with an inauspicious date. They might cast beans or corn kernels to read omens. They'd ask about your dreams, your recent behaviour, whether you'd insulted anyone or neglected any rituals. If the diagnosis was purely physical, a broken bone, a wound, a rash, treatment was straightforward. If the cause was deemed supernatural, things got complicated. Broken bones were set with remarkable skill. The healer would realign the bone, apply splints made from wood or reeds, and bind everything tightly with cloth. They'd give you pain-relieving herbs and tell you to stay off it for weeks. If you followed instructions, you'd probably heal. If you didn't, you'd end up with a crooked limb and chronic pain. But at least they tried, which is more than you can say for some medieval European physicians who might have just amputated and called it a day. Wounds and infections were treated with poultices made from crushed plants, sometimes mixed with honey or animal fat. The Aztecs understood that keeping wounds clean helped prevent infection, even if they didn't know why. They'd wash injuries with boiled water, apply herbal pastes, and bandage them. If infection set in anyway, they might lance the wound to drain pus, using those terrifyingly sharp obsidian blades. No anesthesia, just you, biting down on a leather strap while someone cuts into your infected flesh. Fun times. Fevers were treated with herbs that induce sweating, the theory being that you needed to sweat out the illness. You'd be given teas made from plants like epazote or given a temazcali session. Sometimes this actually helped. Sometimes it just dehydrated you faster. It was a gamble. Stomach issues, incredibly common given the diet and water quality, were treated with a variety of plant-based remedies. Diarrhea, crushed guava leaves, constipation, maguey sap, nausea, ginger root, or mint. Some of these remedies are still used in traditional Mexican medicine today because they legitimately work. But then there were the ailments no one understood. Epilepsy, mental illness, chronic pain, mysterious wasting diseases. These were often attributed to sorcery or divine punishment. If you had seizures, you were believed to be possessed or cursed. Treatment involved exorcism-style rituals, prayers, and offerings to appease whichever god or spirit was tormenting you. If you were depressed or behaving erratically, you might be accused of moral failing or demonic influence. There was no concept of brain chemistry or mental health as we understand it. You were either right with the gods, or you weren't. Surgery existed, but it was rare and reserved for serious cases, removing growths, draining abscesses, or in extreme situations, trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull. Yes, they did brain surgery, with obsidian, while you were conscious. Some patients survived, which is frankly astonishing. The skull fragments show signs of healing, meaning people lived through the procedure and recovered. But many didn't, and those who did probably wished they hadn't, given the agony involved. Pain relief was limited to alcohol, pulque mostly, or certain plants with mild analgesic properties. Nothing close to morphine or even aspirin. You just endured. Pain was part of life, and you were expected to bear it stoically. Complaining was seen as weakness. If the healer couldn't help you, you'd see a priest. And if the priest couldn't help you either, well, you'd just suffer until you died or miraculously recovered. There was no healthcare system, no insurance, no second opinions. You got what you got, and you hoped the gods were feeling generous. Most people died from things that are easily treatable today. Infections, fevers, diarrhea, infected wounds. Life expectancy was low, and illness was a constant companion. You learned to live with discomfort, because comfort was a luxury the Aztec Empire simply didn't offer. At least the herbs smelled nice. The Aztec legal system was strict, public, and absolutely brutal. Laws were clear, and punishments were harsh. Steal something. Depending on what it was and how much, you might become a slave to repay the debt. Steal from the market. Public beating. Get drunk in public. If you were young, you'd be humiliated and possibly executed. Drunkenness was only socially acceptable for the elderly. Commit murder. Execution, often by stoning or strangulation. Adultery. Both parties could be stoned to death. There were judges who presided over cases, and they were expected to be impartial and incorruptible. Bribe a judge, and you'd both be executed. The Aztecs didn't mess around. Punishments were designed to be public spectacles meant to deter others from breaking the law, and there was no such thing as a lengthy appeals process. Justice was swift, certain, and frequently fatal. So if you were thinking about bending the rules, you'd better think twice, or just accept that your life might end very suddenly in front of a jeering crowd. The legal system operated on multiple levels. At the local level, you had neighbourhood councils and minor judges who handled small disputes, property disagreements, petty theft, domestic issues. Above them were district judges, and at the top sat the royal court, where the emperor himself could weigh in on major cases. The whole system was surprisingly organised for a civilization without written legal codes in the Western sense. Laws were passed down orally, memorised by judges and applied consistently. Everyone knew the rules. Ignorance was not an excuse. Judges were chosen for their wisdom, integrity, and knowledge of law and custom. They held enormous power and were expected to be incorruptible, emphasis on expected. If a judge was caught taking bribes, showing favouritism, or making unjust rulings, the punishment was death. Not a fine, not disbarment, death. The Aztecs believed that corrupting justice corrupted the entire social order, which angered the gods and destabilised the empire, so judges were held to an impossibly high standard. And most took their duties very seriously because the alternative was execution. Trials were public. You stood before the judge, presented your case, brought witnesses if you had them, and waited for judgment. There were no lawyers, no legal representation. You spoke for yourself, and you'd better be convincing. The judge would listen to both sides, maybe consult with elders or review precedent, and then render a verdict, usually on the spot. Once the decision was made, punishment was immediate. No waiting in jail for sentencing. No appeals to a higher court unless it was an exceptionally complex case that got bumped up to the emperor's court. Justice was fast, public, and final. Theft was punished according to the value of what was stolen and the circumstances. Steal food because you're starving? You might get away with enslavement to work off the debt. Steal from a merchant in the market. Public beating and possibly enslavement. Steal from a temple or a noble, execution. Steal from the emperor, you, and possibly your entire family are executed as a warning to others. The severity escalated quickly. Public drunkenness was taken surprisingly seriously, but with a weird exception. Old people got a pass. If you were over 50 or 60, you could drink as much pulque as you wanted and stumble around town, and everyone just accepted it. You'd earned the right to be a drunk. But if you were young, say, under 30, and caught drunk in public, you could be beaten, have your head shaved, a mark of shame, or in extreme cases, executed. The reasoning was that young people needed to be productive, disciplined members of society, and alcohol undermined that. Elders had already contributed their labour, and could do whatever they wanted. Adultery was one of the most serious crimes because it violated sacred marriage bonds and disrupted social harmony. If you were caught, and people did get caught, because neighbours loved to gossip and report each other, both parties faced death, usually stoning, sometimes strangulation. The executions were public, meant to shame the offenders and deter others. There was a slight gender imbalance. Women caught in adultery were almost always executed, while men might occasionally escape with slavery or severe beating if the husband was feeling merciful. But generally, both died. Murder was straightforward. You killed someone, you got executed. Method varied: stoning, strangulation, being beaten to death with clubs. It depended on the circumstances and the judge's discretion. If you killed someone in self-defense or by accident, the punishment might be reduced to slavery or a hefty fine paid to the victim's family. But premeditated murder? You were done. Punishments were creative and designed for maximum humiliation and deterrence. Public beatings were common, conducted in the market square where everyone could watch. The offender would be tied to a post and beaten with sticks while the crowd jeered. Head shaving was another popular punishment. Your hair was forcibly cut off, marking you as a criminal. In a society where appearance and status mattered so much, this was devastating. For more serious crimes, execution methods were brutal. Stoning involved being pelted with rocks until you died, which could take a while. Strangulation was done with a garrote or by hand, and in some cases you'd simply be clubbed to death. There was no concept of humane execution. The point was punishment, deterrence, and satisfying the gods' demand for order. The Aztec legal system was effective because it was merciless. Crime rates were relatively low, not because people were inherently virtuous, but because everyone knew the consequences. You didn't steal because you didn't want to become a slave. You didn't commit adultery because you didn't want to be stoned. You didn't murder because you valued your life. Fear wasn't just a side effect of the legal system, it was the point, and it worked. So you kept your head down, followed the rules, and prayed you never found yourself standing in front of a judge, because once you did, your chances of walking away unscathed were very, very slim. The Aztecs had 2 calendars, and both of them controlled every aspect of your existence. First, there was the Xupahuali, a 365-day solar calendar divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unlucky days at the end. Then there was the Tonal Pahuali, a 260-day ritual calendar used for divination and determining auspicious days for everything: warfare, marriage, planting crops, naming children. These 2 calendars meshed together in a 52-year cycle, and every 52 years the Aztecs believed the world might end. So they held a massive new fire ceremony, where all fires in the empire were extinguished, and a new fire was lit on the chest of a sacrificial victim. If the fire caught, the world would continue for another 52 years. If it didn't, well, everyone panicked. Your birth date determined your destiny. Born on a good day? Lucky you. Born on a bad day? Your entire life would be shadowed by misfortune, and there was nothing you could do about it. The calendar wasn't just a way to track time, it was a cosmic mandate that dictated your fate. Let's start with the Xupahuali, the solar calendar that tracked the agricultural year. 18 months of 20 days gives you 360 days, and then there are 5 extra days tacked on at the end called the Nemontim, the empty days. These 5 days are considered deeply unlucky, a cosmic holding pattern where the normal order breaks down. During the Nemontemi, you avoid starting anything new. No marriages, no business deals, no travel if you can help it. You stay home, keep your head down, and pray the days pass without disaster. People born during the Nemontemi are considered cursed from birth, destined for misfortune. It's like being born on Friday the 13th, except it lasts 5 days and everyone actually believes it. Each of the 18 months is associated with specific festivals dedicated to different gods. Month 1, Atalkawalo, dedicated to Tlaloc, involving the sacrifice of children to bring rain. Month 4, Huitzilopochtli, celebrating the maize harvest with offerings and feasting, and so on. Your entire year is structured around these religious observances. You can't just ignore them. Missing a festival is both socially unacceptable and spiritually dangerous. Then there's the Tonal Pahuali, the 260-day ritual calendar, which is even more complicated. It's divided into 20 periods of 13 days, each day represented by a combination of a number, 1 to 13, and one of 20-day signs. Things like Kipactli, crocodile, Kotl, serpent, Quartli, eagle, and so on. Every single day has its own character, its own energy, its own divine influence. Some days are lucky, some are unlucky, some are neutral but become lucky or unlucky depending on what you're trying to do. This calendar governs every major life decision. Want to get married? Better consult a priest to find an auspicious day. Planting crops? Check the Tonal Pahuali. Planning a military campaign? You'd better make sure the day sign favours warfare, or you're doomed before you start. Even naming your child depends on the calendar. If your baby is born on a bad day, you might delay the naming ceremony until a better day comes around, hoping to mitigate some of the cosmic bad luck. Priests, specifically the Tonalpuke, the calendar specialists, were expert interpreters of these cycles. They memorized the entire 260-day sequence, understood the complex interactions between day signs and numbers, and could predict favourable and unfavourable periods. If you needed guidance, you consulted a Tonalpuke, who'd examine your birth date, the current date, and the specific question you were asking, then deliver a reading. Sometimes hopeful, often ominous, always treated as absolute truth. Your Tonali, your day sign, became part of your identity. It was believed to influence your personality, your strengths, your weaknesses, and your ultimate fate. Born on a day associated with Quetzalcoatl, you might be wise, creative, destined for learning. Born on a day ruled by Tezcatlipoca, you're probably going to have a turbulent, chaotic life. Someday signs were so unlucky that parents would try desperately to get the naming ceremony rescheduled, even lying about the actual birth date to protect their child from a lifetime of misfortune. And then there's the 52-year calendar round, the point where both calendars sync up and restart simultaneously. This was a moment of cosmic anxiety. The Aztecs believed the world had been created and destroyed 4 times already, by jaguars, wind, fire, and flood. The current world, the 5th sun, was destined to end in earthquakes, and every 52 years there was a very real chance that this was it, the end times. So they held the new fire ceremony, a massive empire-wide ritual designed to convince the gods to let the world continue. Every fire in every home, temple and hearth across the empire was extinguished. Total darkness. Then, at midnight, priests climbed to the top of a sacred mountain, dragged a sacrificial victim to the altar, cut out his heart, and attempted to light a new fire in the cavity of his chest. If the fire caught, and it always did because they prepared meticulously, it meant the gods had granted another 52 years. The new fire was carried down the mountain, distributed to temples, and from there spread to every household. Relief. Celebration. 52 more years of existence. But imagine the terror if the fire hadn't caught. Entire cities holding their breath in the darkness, waiting for confirmation that the universe would continue. The psychological weight of believing your world might literally end every 52 years is staggering. It created a society constantly aware of its own fragility, always one bad ritual away from annihilation. The calendar wasn't just a tool for tracking time, it was theology, astrology, and fate all rolled into one. It dictated when you fought, when you planted, when you married, when you named your children, and ultimately how you understood your place in the cosmos. You didn't control your destiny. The calendar did, and the calendar was merciless. Your house, if you can call it that, is small, simple, and made of adobe bricks or wattle and daub. 1 or 2 rooms, dirt floors, and a thatched roof that leaks when it rains. There's no furniture to speak of. Maybe a few woven mats for sleeping, some pottery for cooking and storage, and a hearth in the centre of the room where your family prepares meals and tries to stay warm on cold nights. Nobles lived in sprawling stone compounds with multiple rooms, courtyards, and even gardens. You? You're packed in with your entire extended family, plus maybe a few chickens and a dog. Privacy is a fantasy. Ventilation is non-existent, so the smoke from the cooking fire fills the room and makes your eyes water constantly. And if you lived in Tenochtitlan proper, your house was probably built on reclaimed swampland, which meant it was perpetually damp and smelled like mildew. But hey, at least you had a roof. Sort of. The construction is basic but functional. If you're in a rural area, your walls are made of wattle and daub, a frame of wooden poles with woven branches or reeds packed between them, then plastered over with mud mixed with straw and sometimes dung. Yes, dung again. It's a recurring theme. The mud dries hard in the sun, creating walls that are sturdyish and provide some insulation from heat, but they're not waterproof. When the rainy season hits, the walls absorb moisture, soften, and sometimes just dissolve. You patch them constantly, smearing fresh mud over the weak spots, hoping they hold until the rains stop. If you're in Tenochtitlan or another established city, your house might be made of adobe, sun-dried mud bricks stacked and mortared together. It's a step up from wattle and daub, more durable and slightly more prestigious, but it's still humble. The bricks are heavy, uneven, and crack over time. You repair them yourself because hiring someone is out of the question. You can't afford labourers. You are the labourer. The roof is thatched. Bundles of dried grass, reeds, or palm fronds layered and tied to a wooden frame. When it's new, it actually works pretty well, shedding rain and providing shade. But thatch degrades fast. After a year or 2, it starts to rot, sag, and develop holes. Rain drips through. Birds and rodents nest in it. Insects, oh, so many insects, make their homes in the dry, cosy layers. You rethatch sections as needed, but it's labour intensive and you never quite keep up. So you live with a perpetually questionable roof and strategically place pots to catch leaks when it storms. The floor is packed earth, dirt, just dirt. Maybe you've swept it smooth and compacted it over time, but it's still fundamentally the ground. When it rains heavily, water seeps up from below or runs in through the doorway, turning your floor into mud. You spread fresh reeds or mats over the worst spots, but it's a losing battle. The floor is always slightly damp, always dusty, and always hosting a small ecosystem of insects and microorganisms you'd rather not think about. Your hearth sits in the centre of the room or along one wall, a raised platform of stones or clay where you build your cooking fire. There's no chimney. Smoke rises and eventually drifts out through gaps in the thatch or a small opening near the roof. Most of it, however, just hangs in the air, filling the room with a thick, eye-stinging haze. Your lungs adapt. Sort of. Everyone in your family has a chronic cough. It's just normal. You don't know it, but you're slowly developing respiratory issues that will shorten your life. But compared to everything else trying to kill you, smoke inhalation barely registers. Furniture doesn't exist in your world. You sit on woven potato mats made from palm or reed fibres. You sleep on them. You eat on them. They're multi-purpose and also falling apart. Storage is handled with large ceramic pots. Some for water, some for grain, some for cooking. You might have a few woven baskets hanging from the walls. That's it. No chairs, no tables, no beds, no dressers, no shelves. Everything you own fits in one small room and could be packed up in minutes if you needed to flee. Space is tight. If you have a family of 6 or 8, you're all crammed into this one room. Sleeping arrangements are a puzzle. Mats laid out side by side, children squeezed between adults. Everyone sharing body heat because there are no blankets beyond a few rough woven cloths. You hear every snore, every cough, every whispered conversation. Privacy is a concept reserved for the wealthy. You get dressed, undressed, argue, cry, and exist all in the same shared space. And then there are your roommates, the chickens that roost in the corner, pecking at scraps and laying eggs when they feel like it. The dog that sleeps by the hearth and occasionally catches a rat. The family shrine, a small alcove with offerings to household gods, incense burners, and maybe a clay figurine or two. This tiny corner is sacred space, the spiritual heart of your home, where you pray for protection, health, and survival. If you live in Tenochtitlan, your house is probably part of a dense residential block built on a chinampa or on land reclaimed from the lake. That means your foundation is perpetually damp, your walls grow mould, and the smell of lake water, fishy, organic, vaguely swampy, is a constant background note. Your neighbours are inches away, separated by thin walls. You hear everything they do. They hear everything you do. Community living at its finest. Noble homes, by contrast, are sprawling estates built from stone, with multiple rooms arranged around courtyards. They have gardens, fountains, separate sleeping quarters, storage rooms, and dedicated spaces for servants. Some even have private Temescali bathhouses. It's a different universe. You walk past these compounds sometimes, glimpsing the grandeur through open gates, and it's a reminder of just how far away you are from that kind of life. But your house, for all its flaws, is yours. It's shelter. It keeps most of the rain out. It's where your family gathers, where children are born, where elders die. It's not much, but in the Aztec Empire, not much is all most people ever get, and honestly, you're too tired to dream of better. Slavery in the Aztec Empire wasn't race-based or hereditary, like it was in other parts of the world. You could become a slave by selling yourself to pay off debts, by being captured in war, or by being convicted of certain crimes. Slaves could own property, marry, and even buy their freedom. Their children were born free. So in some ways it was less brutal than other forms of slavery. But let's not sugarcoat it. It was still slavery. You had no freedom. You worked for someone else without pay, and you could be sold at the market like a piece of pottery. And if your owner decided you were troublesome or no longer useful, you could be sacrificed. So yes, Aztec slavery had some unusual features, but it was still a system of forced labour and exploitation. And if you were unlucky enough to end up as a slave, your best hope was to work hard, stay obedient, and save up enough to buy your way out before someone decided you'd make a good offering to the gods. The most common path to slavery was debt. Maybe you gambled and lost everything. Maybe a bad harvest left you unable to pay tribute. Maybe you borrowed resources you couldn't repay. Rather than face starvation or legal punishment, you could sell yourself into slavery. You'd approach a potential owner, negotiate terms, and sign yourself over. Well, not literally sign, but make a formal agreement witnessed by authorities. You became property, but temporary property. The idea was that you'd work off your debt, and once it was paid, you'd be free again. In practice, many people never managed to save enough or work off what they owed. The system was designed to keep you enslaved. War captives formed another large group of slaves. If you were captured in battle but deemed unsuitable for sacrifice, maybe you were too young, too old, or just not prestigious enough, you'd be enslaved instead. You'd be marched back to Tenochtitlan, sold in the market and put to work. Your value depended on your skills, strength, and age. A young, healthy warrior might fetch a high price. An elderly farmer, not so much. Criminals could also be enslaved as punishment. Steal something valuable? Enslavement. Fail to pay a fine? Enslavement. Commit certain non-capital offences? Believe it or not, enslavement. It was a flexible punishment that benefited the victim or the state, while giving the criminal a chance, however slim, to eventually regain freedom. Once enslaved, your life depended entirely on your owner. Some owners were relatively benign. You'd work as a household servant, tend gardens, haul water, cook, clean. Hard labour, yes, but not brutal. You'd be fed, housed, and treated as part of the household infrastructure. Other owners were cruel. You'd be worked to exhaustion, beaten for minor infractions, and treated as disposable. There was no regulatory body ensuring humane treatment. Your welfare was entirely at your owner's discretion. Slaves could own property, which sounds bizarre but was actually practical. If you were skilled, say a craftsman or a merchant, you could conduct business on behalf of your owner and keep a small percentage of the profits. Over time, you might accumulate enough to buy your freedom. The price was usually equivalent to the original purchase price plus interest, which could be substantial. But it was possible. Some slaves did buy their way out, and once free, they rejoined society as full members. No permanent stigma, no slave caste. You were just a person who'd been enslaved and now wasn't. Marriage was allowed. A slave could marry another slave, or even a free person. If a slave married a free person, the slave remained enslaved, but any children from that union were born free. This was a huge distinction from slavery in the Americas or ancient Rome, where the children of slaves were automatically enslaved. In the Aztec system, slavery didn't transfer across generations. It was a condition, not an identity. But here's the dark part. Slaves could be sacrificed. If your owner designated you for sacrifice, or sold you to someone who did, you had no recourse. You'd be dressed in ceremonial garb, marched up the pyramid, and killed. Some slaves were specifically purchased for this purpose, especially during major festivals when large numbers of victims were needed. Merchants and nobles would buy slaves in bulk, fatten them up, and present them as offerings to the gods. It was considered charitable, in a twisted way. The owner got religious merit and the slave got a warrior's death, and a guaranteed spot in the afterlife paradise. But let's be real, you didn't volunteer for this. You were property, and property doesn't get to choose. The slave market in Tlatelolco was a grim place. Slaves stood on raised platforms, sometimes naked so buyers could inspect them for health and strength. Sellers shouted out their skills and attributes like livestock auctioneers. Strong back, excellent weaver, only 20 years old. Buyers haggled, checked teeth, felt muscles, and negotiated prices. The whole process was dehumanizing, transactional, and completely normalized. Families walking through the market to buy corn would pass the slave section without a second glance. Some slaves wore wooden collars, heavy yokes placed around their necks to prevent escape. These were reserved for troublesome or newly captured slaves deemed flight risks. The collars were uncomfortable, humiliating, and marked you visibly as enslaved. Most slaves didn't wear them, but the threat was always there. Misbehave and you'd be collared. Try to escape and you'd be caught, beaten, and possibly sold to someone worse, or sacrificed outright. Escape was rare. Where would you go? Tenochtitlan was an island city. The surrounding territories were all part of the empire. If you ran, you'd be caught and returned, and your punishment would be severe. So most slaves endured, worked, and hoped for eventual freedom. The Aztec system of slavery was pragmatic and in some ways less horrific than other historical forms of bondage, but it was still slavery. You were owned. Your labour was exploited. Your life was not your own. And at any moment you could be designated for sacrifice, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, you could do about it. So yes, you could theoretically buy your freedom, but first you had to survive long enough to afford it. When you died in the Aztec Empire, where your soul ended up wasn't determined by how good or bad you were. It was determined by how you died. Die in battle or in childbirth. You went to the paradise of the sun god, where you'd spend 4 years accompanying the sun across the sky before being reincarnated as a hummingbird or butterfly, drown, get struck by lightning, or die of certain diseases. You went to Tlailakhan, the paradise of the rain god, a lush, eternal garden. Die of old age or natural causes. You went to Mictlan, the underworld, and embarked on a 4-year journey through 9 levels of trials, challenges, and dangers before finally reaching eternal rest. To help you on this journey, your family would bury you with food, water, and a dog to guide you. Funerals were sombre affairs with mourning, ritual sacrifices, and offerings to ensure your safe passage. Death wasn't the end. It was just another transition in the endless cosmic cycle. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. Let's start with the best-case scenario, dying as a warrior or in childbirth. These deaths were considered equal in honour. Both were sacrifices that fed the cosmic order. If you died in battle, your soul ascended to the eastern paradise, the house of the sun. For 4 years you joined the sun god Tonatiuh on his daily journey from dawn to zenith, accompanying him as an honoured warrior spirit. After 4 years, you'd transform into a hummingbird or a brightly coloured butterfly, flitting through gardens and feeding on flowers for eternity. It was the Aztec version of heaven, vibrant, active, and glorious. Women who died in childbirth received the same honour. They were Chihuateteo, warrior women who'd fought and lost in the ultimate battle. Their souls went to the western paradise, where they accompanied the sun from zenith to sunset. After 4 years, they too could transform into hummingbirds or moths. But there was a darker side to the Cihuateteo. They were also believed to haunt crossroads at night, bringing madness and illness to children. So even in death, women who died in childbirth were both honoured and feared. If you drowned, were struck by a lightning, died from leprosy, gout, or certain other diseases associated with the rain god Tlaloc, your soul went to Tlailakhan, the paradise of eternal spring. This was an actual paradise. Lush gardens, abundant food, no pain, no suffering. You'd spend eternity in comfort and plenty. It was random, arbitrary, and honestly kind of unfair. Get hit by lightning? Paradise. Die of old age after a life of hard work? The underworld. The Aztec afterlife didn't reward virtue. It rewarded the manner of death. But most people, the vast majority, died of mundane causes. Illness, old age, accidents, infections. And if that was you, your soul went to Mictlan, the underworld, ruled by Mictlantecuhtli, the skeletal lord of the dead, and his wife Mictecatihuatl. Mictlan wasn't hell in the Christian sense. There was no eternal torment based on sins. But it wasn't pleasant either. It was a dark, cold, silent realm deep beneath the earth, and getting there was a nightmare. The journey to Mictlan took 4 years and required passing through 9 increasingly difficult levels. First, you had to cross a wide river. This is where your burial dog came in. The Aztecs often sacrificed a dog and buried it with the deceased specifically to guide them across this river. The dog would recognize its owner's soul and help them swim or ferry them across. Without a dog, you were stuck. Next, you navigated between 2 mountains that crashed together repeatedly, trying to crush anyone passing through. Then you climbed a mountain of obsidian, razor-sharp volcanic glass that sliced your feet, or soul feet or whatever, to ribbons. You crossed a frozen wasteland where icy winds tore at you. You endured a region where stone blades flew through the air, cutting anything in their path. You faced jaguars that devoured hearts. You crossed narrow paths over abysses. Each level was designed to strip away the remnants of your earthly existence, eroding your identity until you were nothing but pure essence. After 4 years, if you made it, you finally reached the deepest level of Mictlan, where you found eternal rest. Not bliss, not torture, just rest. Cessation. The end of the journey. Your soul dissolved into the cosmic void, rejoining the primordial forces from which all life came. It was oblivion, but peaceful oblivion. You'd earned it. Funerals reflected the destination. If you were a warrior or a woman who died in childbirth, your body was cremated and your ashes were treated with great honour. Offerings were made, songs were sung, and your name was remembered. If you were headed to Mictlan, your body was bundled in a crouched position, wrapped in cloth, and buried with grave goods. Pottery vessels filled with food and water, tools you might need, small figurines, and most importantly your dog. Families who could afford it sacrificed a Zoloit's Quintili, the hairless Mexican dog breed specifically bred as companions in life and guides in death. Mourning lasted for days. Your family wept, burned incense, and performed rituals at regular intervals, after death, after burial, and at specific points over the next 4 years to help your soul on its journey. 80 days after death, another ceremony was held, then 1 year, then 2, then 4, marking the completion of your journey to Mictlan. Only then could your family fully move on, knowing you'd reached your final rest. The Aztec view of death was fatalistic, but also strangely comforting. You couldn't control where you went. That was determined by fate, the gods, and the manner of your death. But everyone ended up somewhere. The universe had a place for every soul, and the journey, while difficult, was temporary. Death wasn't punishment, it was transformation. Still, as you lay dying, feverish, in pain, surrounded by your weeping family, you probably weren't thinking about cosmic cycles or eternal rest. You were thinking about the river, the mountains, the obsidian, and whether your dog would actually remember you. And hoping, desperately, that someone remembered to bury you with a good one. Let's talk about keeping food from rotting, because refrigeration is still a few centuries away. The Aztecs were masters of preservation by necessity. Corn could be dried and stored for months. Beans, same deal. Chilies were dried in the sun and strung up in bundles. Meat, when you had it, was either dried into jerky or cooked and eaten immediately, because it would spoil in hours in the heat. Fish from the lake, smoked or salted. Cacao beans, one of the most valuable commodities, were stored in sealed containers to keep them from getting mouldy. The Aztecs also made use of fermentation. Pulque, the mildly alcoholic drink made from maguey sap, was consumed daily and had a short shelf life, so it was made fresh in huge quantities. There was no such thing as leftovers in the modern sense. You ate what you had when you had it, and you didn't waste a single kernel of corn or scrap of tortilla. Waste wasn't just impractical. It was borderline sacrilegious in a society where food security was always precarious. Corn, the foundation of everything, was preserved through drying. After harvest, you'd strip the kernels from the cobs and spread them out in the sun on woven mats or flat rooftops. The tropical sun did the work, evaporating moisture and turning the kernels hard as pebbles. Once fully dried, corn could be stored in large ceramic jars or woven baskets for months, even years if kept dry and away from pests. Before eating, you'd soak the kernels in lime water, nixtamalization, which softened them and made them grindable. This process was so effective that dried corn became a form of currency and tribute. You could transport it, trade it, and hoard it without worrying about spoilage. Beans followed the same principle. Dried beans lasted indefinitely if stored properly. You'd soak them overnight before cooking, boiling them into soft, edible mush. Combined with corn, beans provided complete protein. Not that the Aztecs understood amino acids, but they knew the combination kept people alive and working. Chilies were everywhere, and drying them was simple. String them up in long ristras and hang them in the sun or near the hearth. The heat dried them out, concentrating their flavour and heat. Dried chilies could be ground into powder, rehydrated in cooking, or eaten as for a painful mouth-burning snack. They lasted for months and added desperately needed flavour to an otherwise bland diet. Meat preservation was trickier. Fresh meat spoiled within hours in the heat and humidity, so if you slaughtered a turkey or caught a fish, you had to act fast. One option: eat it immediately, inviting neighbours and extended family for a feast because you couldn't possibly consume an entire turkey by yourself. Sharing wasn't just generosity, it was practical. You fed others now, they'd feed you later when they had surplus. If you needed to preserve meat, you dried it into jerky. Thin strips of meat were salted, if you had salt, which was expensive, and hung in the sun or smoked over a low fire. The combination of salt, smoke, and dehydration created a tough, leathery product that lasted weeks or even months. It wasn't delicious. It was chewy, salty, and required soaking before eating. But it was protein, and protein was precious. Fish from Lake Texcoco were abundant, and preservation techniques varied. Smoking was popular. Fish were gutted, split open, and hung over smoky fires until they were dried and infused with that distinctive smoky flavour. Salted fish was another option, though salt was a luxury item controlled by the state and nobles. Most commoners couldn't afford to salt fish in large quantities, so smoking was the go-to method. Cacao beans, used as currency and for making chocolate, required careful storage. They were kept in sealed ceramic jars or woven bags, stored in cool, dry places to prevent mould. Mouldy cacao was worthless, and since cacao beans were literally money, losing them to spoilage was a financial disaster. Wealthy merchants guarded their cacao stores obsessively. Fermentation was another preservation method, most famously for making pulque. The maguey plant produced a sweet sap called aguamiel, which fermented naturally within hours in the heat. The result was pulque, a thick, slightly sour, mildly alcoholic drink that was consumed by everyone: men, women, children in smaller amounts, nobles, and commoners. Pulque had to be consumed within a day or two before it turned into vinegar or just spoiled completely. So households made it fresh constantly, and pulque vendors in the market sold it by the cup to thirsty workers. Fermentation also applied to certain vegetables and sauces. Fermented chili sauces, similar to modern hot sauces, could last longer than fresh chilies and developed complex tangy flavours. But these were luxuries. Most people didn't have time or resources for elaborate fermentation projects. Storage itself was a challenge. You had ceramic jars, woven baskets, and not much else. Rodents, insects, and humidity were constant threats. Mice could chew through baskets. Weevils infested grain. Mould crept into anything damp. You fought a constant battle against nature, checking your stores regularly, removing spoiled items and rotating stock. There was no concept of a pantry stocked with months of food. You lived season to season, harvest to harvest. A bad harvest year meant famine. A good year meant temporary security, but never abundance. You stored what you could, preserved what was possible, and ate everything else immediately. And waste? Absolutely unacceptable. Every scrap of tortilla was eaten. Stale tortillas were reheated or crumbled into soups. Bones were boiled for broth. Vegetable scraps went to chickens or dogs. Nothing, and I mean nothing, was thrown away. Food was sacred, a gift from the gods, and wasting it was both impractical and spiritually offensive. The Aztecs lived on a knife's edge of subsistence, where a single bad storm, a pest infestation, or a failed harvest could mean starvation. Preservation wasn't a hobby or a culinary art, it was survival. You dried, smoked, salted, and fermented not because you wanted to, but because if you didn't, you'd starve. And in a world without grocery stores, without refrigeration, without safety nets, keeping food from rotting was the difference between life and death. So yes, you ate a lot of dried corn and jerky, and yes, it was monotonous and tough and bland, but it kept you alive. And that was enough. The Aztecs had a complicated relationship with animals. Dogs, specifically a breed called the Xoloitzcuintli, were kept as companions, guards, and food. Yes, dog meat was eaten, especially on special occasions. Turkeys were also domesticated and raised for meat and feathers, but most animals served practical purposes. Jaguars, eagles, and snakes were sacred and featured heavily in religious symbolism, but you weren't keeping them as pets. Parrots and other colourful birds were prized for their feathers, which were used to create elaborate headdresses and cloaks for the nobility. If you were wealthy, you might have a small menagerie, but if you were a commoner, your pets were working animals or future meals. There was no sentimentality about it. Animals existed to serve human needs, whether that was labour, food, or religious symbolism. So if you got attached to your dog, maybe don't think too hard about what's in that tamale. Let's start with the Xoloitzcuintli, or Xolo for short, the hairless Mexican dog that was absolutely everywhere in Aztec society. These dogs were small to medium-sized, with smooth, hairless skin that ranged from black to grey to reddish-brown. They were kept as companions, yes, and they did provide warmth on cold nights. Literally, you'd cuddle with them for body heat. They also served as guards, barking at intruders or strangers. But here's the uncomfortable truth. They were also bred for meat. Dog meat was considered a delicacy, reserved for feasts, festivals, and special occasions. It wasn't everyday food. You didn't casually eat your dog on a Tuesday. But if there was a wedding, a religious ceremony, or a visit from important guests, dog might be on the menu. The meat was reportedly tender and flavourful, and it was prepared in various ways: roasted, stewed, or wrapped in leaves and steamed. If you were a commoner, you probably only ate dog meat a few times in your life. If you were wealthy, it was more common. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Xolos were also burial companions. When you died, a Xolo was often sacrificed and buried with you to guide your soul through Mictlan. So the same dog that slept by your hearth, ate scraps from your table, and followed you around might also end up either in a stew or in your grave. It's a pragmatic, unsentimental relationship that modern pet owners would find horrifying. Turkeys, Quetzalcoatl in Nahuatl, were the other major domesticated animal. They were kept in pens or allowed to roam near houses, gobbling obnoxiously and providing eggs, meat and feathers. Turkey meat was more commonly eaten than dog, especially by nobles who could afford regular poultry. The feathers were valuable too, used in headdresses, fans, and ceremonial garments. Turkeys were noisy, messy, and not particularly affectionate, but they were practical. You raised them, you ate them, and you used every part. Beyond domesticated animals, the Aztec world was filled with creatures that held deep symbolic and religious significance. Jaguars were apex predators, associated with warriors, night, and the underworld. Jaguar pelts were worn by elite jaguar warriors, and capturing a live jaguar was a mark of extraordinary bravery. But you didn't keep jaguars as pets. They were dangerous, revered, and symbolic. The emperor and nobles maintained menageries, essentially private zoos, where jaguars, pumas, and other exotic animals were kept for display and religious purposes. These weren't pets. They were living symbols of power. Eagles were equally sacred, associated with the sun god Huitzilopochtli and the heavens. Eagle warriors wore elaborate costumes featuring eagle feathers and carved wooden helmets shaped like eagle heads. Live eagles were captured and kept in the royal menagerie, fed on hearts from sacrificial victims, yes, really, and treated with reverence. Again, not pets, sacred animals. Snakes held a special place in Aztec cosmology. The feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, was one of the most important deities. Snakes represented transformation, wisdom, and the connection between earth and sky. They appeared in carvings, murals, and religious iconography everywhere. But in daily life, snakes were also just snakes, dangerous, sometimes venomous, and generally avoided unless you were a priest performing rituals. Parrots, macaws, and quetzals were prized for their feathers. These birds were trapped or traded from tropical regions far to the south. Their brilliantly coloured feathers, green, blue, red, yellow, were used to create the elaborate feather mosaics and headdresses worn by nobility and used in ceremonies. A single quetzal tail feather could be worth a small fortune. The birds themselves were kept in cages, plucked periodically for their feathers, and not particularly well treated. They were feather factories, not companions. Commoners had few animals beyond the practical. Maybe a dog, maybe some chickens scratching around the house, laying eggs sporadically and providing the occasional meal. Maybe a turkey if you were doing well. That was it. You didn't have the resources or space for anything more, and sentimentality was a luxury you couldn't afford. If food was scarce, the dog got eaten. If you needed feathers for tribute, the turkey got plucked. Animals served functions, and when they stopped being useful, they stopped being around. The emperor's menagerie in Tenochtitlan, by contrast, was legendary. It housed jaguars, pumas, eagles, snakes, exotic birds, and even alligators. Servants fed and cared for the animals, and nobles visited to marvel at the collection. It was a display of wealth and power. Look at all these dangerous, beautiful creatures I control. But even there, the animals weren't pets. They were trophies, symbols, living proof of the emperor's dominion over nature. Insects, too, had their place. Grasshoppers, ants, and other edible bugs were harvested and eaten, especially during lean times. They were crunchy, protein-rich, and free if you could catch them. Some insects, like cochineal, tiny bugs that lived on cactus plants, were harvested for the vibrant red dye they produced. Cochineal dye was one of the most valuable exports from the Aztec Empire, worth its weight in gold. So yes, the Aztecs had animals, but the relationship was transactional, not emotional. Your dog loved you, sure, but you might eat it someday. Your turkey provided eggs until it didn't, and then it provided dinner, and those beautiful parrots. Their feathers were worth more than their lives. It was a practical, unsentimental world, and in that world survival always came first. When the Aztecs wanted entertainment, they didn't do things halfway. There were ball games, specifically ulamalisli, a ritual sport played with a heavy rubber ball that players had to hit with their hips, thighs, or elbows. The game had deep religious significance, and in some cases, the losing team, or sometimes the winning team depending on the region, was sacrificed. So, high stakes. There were also festivals, dozens of them throughout the year, each dedicated to different gods and involving music, dancing, feasting, and yes, more sacrifice. Commoners participated in public celebrations, which were some of the few times they got to eat meat, drink pulque without judgment, and take a break from work. Nobles had access to more refined entertainment, poetry, music performed by professional musicians, and elaborate theatrical performances. But for most people, entertainment was communal, loud, and deeply intertwined with religion. There were no passive spectators. Everyone participated, whether you were dancing, chanting, or just watching someone's heart get ripped out on top of a pyramid. The ball game, ulamalisli, was the Aztec version of extreme sports. The court was eye-shaped, with sloped stone walls and sometimes stone rings mounted high on the sides. The ball was solid rubber, about the size of a basketball, and weighed up to 8 pounds. That's important, because you weren't allowed to use your hands or feet. You had to hit the ball with your hips, thighs, elbows, or shoulders, and the ball was heavy and travelling fast. Getting hit hurt. A lot. Players wore protective padding, leather belts around their waists, padding on their knees and elbows, but bruises, broken bones, and internal injuries were common. This wasn't a casual pickup game, it was brutal. The rules varied by region, but generally you scored points by keeping the ball in play and hitting it through the stone rings, an incredibly difficult feat. Some versions of the game didn't even use rings. You just tried to get the ball past the opposing team's end line. Games could last hours, with players diving, lunging, and slamming their bodies into the ball to keep it moving. The crowd roared, bets were placed, and everyone knew what was at stake. The game had deep religious symbolism. The court represented the underworld, the ball represented the sun or a decapitated head, depending on which myth you believed. The game reenacted cosmic battles between light and darkness, life and death, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the losing team was sacrificed. Or, in a twist that makes even less sense, the winning team was sacrificed because they'd proven themselves worthy offerings to the gods. Either way, playing ulamalisli was a gamble with your life. But if you survived and won, you gained honour, prestige, and possibly some very nice prizes. Spectators who'd bet on the winning team could win clothing, jewellery, or even slaves. Festivals were the real entertainment highlights of the Aztec year. With 18 months and dozens of gods, there was always something to celebrate. Each festival had its own flavour. Some were sombre and involved fasting. Others were raucous parties with music, dancing, feasting and drinking. The festival of Toxcatl, for example, featured the sacrifice of a young man who'd been living as the embodiment of the god Tezcatlipoca for a year. But before his death, there was massive public celebration. Music, dancing, processions through the city. Everyone participated. Music was everywhere during festivals. Drums, the huhuetl and teponaztli, provided the rhythmic foundation. Flutes, Rattles and conch shell trumpets added melody and texture. The sound was loud, repetitive, and hypnotic, designed to induce a trance-like state. Musicians were professionals, trained from childhood and held in high regard. Playing the wrong rhythm or missing a beat during a sacred ceremony could result in punishment or death. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual communication with the gods. Dancing was participatory. Everyone, from commoners to nobles, joined in. Dances were choreographed and often told stories, myths of creation, battles between gods, the cycles of the seasons. Dancers wore elaborate costumes. There were masks and body paint. Some dances lasted for hours, with participants moving in synchronized patterns around the central plaza. It was exhausting, hypnotic, and deeply communal. You weren't watching a performance, you were part of it. Feasting during festivals was one of the few times commoners got to eat well. Meat, turkey, dog, fish was distributed. Tamales were made in massive quantities. Cacao was drunk, though only by those who could afford it or were given it as part of the celebration. Pulque flowed freely, and public drunkenness was not only tolerated but expected during certain festivals. It was a release valve, a rare moment when the strict rules and constant labour were set aside. Nobles had access to more refined entertainment. Poetry recitals, for example, were a high art form. Aztec poetry was complex, metaphorical, and often improvised. Nobles would gather in palace courtyards to recite and compose verses, competing to create the most beautiful or profound lines. Themes included the transience of life, the beauty of flowers, the inevitability of death, and the glory of the gods. It was philosophical, melancholic, and deeply valued. Theatre also existed, though it was more ritualized than modern theatre. Performers would reenact myths, wearing costumes and masks to embody gods and legendary heroes. These performances were staged during major festivals and were both entertainment and religious instruction, teaching the audience about the gods, the creation of the world, and the proper way to live. Gambling was popular across all social classes. Bets were placed on everything: ball games, dice games, board games. The Aztecs had a game called Patoli, a board game involving beans used as dice. Players moved pieces around a cross-shaped board, and the stakes could be high: jewellery, clothing, even one's freedom. Gambling debts were taken seriously, and losing badly could result in enslavement. Children had their own forms of play, though even childhood games often mimicked adult activities. Boys played with miniature weapons, practicing for future warrior roles. Girls played with dolls and miniature weaving looms. Play wasn't frivolous, it was training. But the most visceral, unavoidable form of public entertainment was sacrifice. You couldn't ignore it. The drumming, the processions, the victims led up the pyramid steps. It was theatre on a massive, terrifying scale. Crowds gathered, people watched, and whether it was horror, reverence, or just numb acceptance, everyone bore witness. Entertainment in the Aztec Empire wasn't an escape from reality. It was reality, intensified, ritualized, and made communal. You didn't watch passively. You participated. You danced. You chanted. You ate. You drank. And you remembered that life was short. The gods were watching, and every moment of joy was borrowed time before the next sacrifice. At least the music was good. Clothing in the Aztec Empire wasn't fashion. It was law. Sumptuary laws strictly regulated who could wear what, and violating these laws could get you executed. Commoners wore plain, undyed cotton or maguey fibre garments. Simple loincloths for men, wrap skirts for women, and basic cloaks. That's it. No decoration, no colour, no flair. Nobles, on the other hand, wore intricately embroidered cloaks, tunics dyed with expensive pigments like cochineal, a red dye made from crushed insects, and elaborate headdresses adorned with feathers from tropical birds like quetzals. The more feathers, the higher your status. Warriors who distinguished themselves in battle earned the right to wear specific garments and insignia that broadcast their achievements. Priests wore black robes, often stained with blood from ritual sacrifices. You could tell someone's entire life story just by looking at what they wore. So if you tried to dress above your station, you weren't just being tacky, you were committing a crime. And the punishment: public humiliation, beating, or death. Fashion police, but make it lethal. The sumptuary laws were exhaustive and specific. As a commoner, your tilmatli, Your cloak could not extend below your knees. That's the law. Nobles could wear cloaks that dragged on the ground, sweeping dramatically as they walked. You, knee-length maximum. If you were caught wearing a longer cloak, guards could stop you, publicly strip it off, beat you, and possibly drag you before a judge. The punishment escalated based on how flagrant the violation was. A slightly too long cloak might earn you a beating and a warning. A cloak decorated with embroidery or feathers? That's a capital offence. You'd be executed as an example to others. Colour was another marker. Commoners wore undyed fabric. Beige, tan, off-white. Natural fibres in their natural state. Nobles wore vibrant colours. Deep reds from cochineal beetles, blues from indigo, purples from rare shellfish, yellows from specific flowers. Each dye was expensive and labour-intensive to produce. Wearing dyed cloth wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a display of wealth and power. A crimson cloak said, "I can afford to crush thousands of beetles and pay someone to dye this fabric." You, in your beige sack, said, "I'm trying not to starve." Feathers were the ultimate status symbol. Quetzal feathers, iridescent green tail feathers from the resplendent quetzal bird found in tropical rainforests, were worth more than gold. A single feather could cost as much as a slave. Nobles wore headdresses and cloaks adorned with these feathers, creating shimmering, otherworldly displays. Eagle and hummingbird feathers were also prized. Commoners were absolutely forbidden from wearing feathers. Even possessing them without authorization was illegal. If you found a quetzal feather on the ground and kept it, you could be accused of theft and enslaved or executed. Warriors had their own dress code earned through battlefield achievements. Capture your first enemy, and you earned the right to wear a simple warrior's tunic and a basic insignia. Capture 4 enemies, and you could join the elite jaguar or eagle warriors, wearing full costumes made from actual jaguar pelts, or elaborate feathered eagle suits with carved wooden helmets. These weren't just uniforms, they were walking resumes, broadcasting your military success to everyone who saw you. Warriors also wore specific hairstyles. The more prisoners you captured, the more elaborate your top knot or the more decorations you could add to your hair. Priests dressed in black, always black. Their robes were stained with blood, their own from auto-sacrifice and others from performing rituals. They never washed their hair, which grew long, matted and crusted with dried blood. They wore minimal adornments, emphasizing austerity and devotion. But their simplicity was deceptive. Priests wielded enormous power, and their bloody, dishevelled appearance commanded fear and respect. Women's clothing followed similar rules. Commoner women wore simple wrap skirts, quetel, and sleeveless tunics, huipil, all undyed and undecorated. Noble women wore elaborately embroidered huipils with intricate patterns, dyed skirts, and jewellery, jade necklaces, gold earrings, turquoise bracelets. Their clothing took months to create, involving skilled weavers and artisans. A noble woman's wardrobe was a family investment, passed down through generations. Jewellery was similarly regulated. Commoners could wear simple shell or clay beads. Maybe a basic necklace or bracelet. Nobles wore jade, carved into beads, pendants, ear spools, nose plugs and lip plugs. Jade was sacred, associated with life and fertility, and owning large pieces signified divine favour and social power. Gold, while valued, was actually less prestigious than jade, though it was still reserved for the elite. Commoners caught wearing jade or gold jewellery faced immediate punishment. Even hairstyles were regulated. Commoner men wore their hair long and tied back simply. Noble men had elaborate styles, sometimes incorporating ornaments. Unmarried women wore their hair loose or in simple braids. Married women wore their hair up, often in 2 buns above the ears, a style that announced marital status to everyone. Children's clothing also reflected status. Noble children wore miniature versions of adult finery, tiny embroidered cloaks, small jade earrings. Commoner children wore almost nothing until they were older, just simple loincloths or skirts, because fabric was expensive and children outgrew things quickly. The visual hierarchy was inescapable. You could walk through Tenochtitlan and immediately identify everyone's status just by glancing at them. The feathered noble gliding through the market, the blood-stained priest chanting at the temple, the warrior in his jaguar pelt. The commoner in beige, eyes down, trying not to attract attention. Clothing wasn't personal expression, it was social control, a visual enforcement of hierarchy that reminded everyone constantly where they stood. And if you forgot, if you got ambitious and tried to wear something above your station, society reminded you swiftly and violently, because in the Aztec Empire your clothing wasn't just fabric, it was law, identity and survival. Step out of line and you'd lose more than your wardrobe, you'd lose your life. Music was everywhere in Aztec life, and it wasn't just for fun, it was sacred. Drums, flutes, rattles and conch shell trumpets provided the soundtrack to religious ceremonies, festivals, and yes, sacrifices. The teponaztli, a wooden drum, and the huehuetl, a vertical drum, were the most important instruments, and their rhythms could be heard across the entire city during major ceremonies. Music wasn't background noise, it was a form of communication with the gods. Dance was equally important. Elaborate, choreographed dances were performed by groups of trained dancers, often wearing costumes and masks. These weren't casual performances, they were rituals meant to honour the gods and ensure cosmic balance. Commoners participated in public dances during festivals, but professional dancers were highly skilled and held in high regard. There was even a patron god of music and dance, Xochipilli. So if you had rhythm, you were in luck. If you didn't, well, just try to blend in at the back and hope nobody notices you're off beat. Because in the Aztec Empire, even dance was serious business. The teponaztli was a horizontal wooden drum carved from a single log, with two tongues cut into the top that produced different pitches when struck. The sound was deep, resonant, and could carry for miles across the city. During major ceremonies, multiple teponaztli drums played in synchronized rhythms, creating complex polyrhythmic patterns that signaled which god was being honored and what phase of the ritual was underway. You could hear the drums from anywhere in Tenochtitlan and know immediately, something important is happening. Pay attention, participate, or at least stop what you're doing and face the temple. The huehuetl was a vertical drum, taller and narrower, made from a hollowed log with animal skin stretched tightly across the top. It was played with the hands, producing a sharp, percussive sound that punctuated the deeper teponaztli rhythms. Together, these drums formed the heartbeat of Aztec religious life. They weren't just instruments. They were sacred objects, often decorated with carvings of gods and painted in bright colours. Damaging or disrespecting a ceremonial drum was sacrilege. Flutes, made from clay, bone, or reed, added melody. Some were simple, producing only a few notes. Others were complex, capable of playing haunting, mournful tunes that drifted through the city at dawn or dusk. Flutes accompanied everything. Processions, dances, sacrifices. The sound was eerie, beautiful, and deeply tied to specific rituals. Certain melodies were only played during certain ceremonies, and everyone recognized them instantly. Rattles, made from gourds filled with seeds or small stones, provided texture and rhythm. Dancers often carried rattles, shaking them in time with their movements. Conch shell trumpets, loud, brassy, and impossible to ignore, announced the start of important ceremonies or the arrival of dignitaries. Blowing a conch shell trumpet required serious lung power, and the sound was piercing, echoing across the valley like an ancient air horn. Musicians were professionals trained from childhood in specialized schools. They memorized complex rhythms, learned the proper melodies for each god and ceremony, and understood the spiritual significance of every note. A mistake during a sacred ceremony, playing the wrong rhythm, missing a beat, starting too early or too late, could derail the entire ritual and anger the gods. The consequences range from public humiliation to execution, depending on the severity. So musicians practiced obsessively, and during performances they were utterly focused. This wasn't a gig. This was cosmic maintenance. Dance was inseparable from music. Every festival featured massive public dances involving hundreds or even thousands of participants. These weren't freestyle dance parties. They were carefully choreographed performances with specific steps, formations, and costumes for each dance. The dances told stories, myths of creation, battles between gods, the cycles of planting and harvest. Dancers moved in synchronized lines, circles, and spirals, their movements precise and rehearsed. Professional dancers underwent years of training. They learned dozens of dances, each with its own meaning and purpose. They wore elaborate costumes, feathered headdresses, painted body designs, masks carved to resemble gods or animals. During performances, they didn't just dance, they embodied divine forces. A dancer wearing the mask of Tlaloc became Tlaloc, channeling the rain god's power through movement. It was theatre, ritual and prayer all at once. Commoners participated too, especially during major festivals. You didn't need to be a professional to join the public dances, you just needed to know the basic steps, which were taught from childhood. Dancing was communal, a way to physically participate in honouring the gods. You'd join the mass of people in the plaza, moving in sync with the drums, chanting prayers, and feeling the collective energy of hundreds of bodies moving as one. It was exhausting, hypnotic, and spiritually powerful. But there was pressure. If you messed up, stepped the wrong direction, lost the rhythm, fell down, you'd be noticed. And while commoners weren't executed for bad dancing, you'd definitely face social embarrassment and possibly accusations of disrespect. So even casual participants took it seriously. You learned the steps, you practiced, you showed up sober, and you gave it your full effort because the gods were watching. Xochipilli, the god of music, dance, flowers and pleasure, was the patron of all artistic expression. He was often depicted sitting cross-legged, his body adorned with flowers and psychedelic mushrooms, smiling serenely. Offerings to Xochipilli included flowers, incense and performances. Musicians and dancers prayed to him before major ceremonies, asking for skill, grace and divine favour. He was one of the few Aztec gods associated with joy rather than terror, though even he had a darker side. He was also linked to excess, intoxication, and forbidden pleasures. Music and dance weren't entertainment in the modern sense. They were obligations, forms of worship, and ways to maintain cosmic order. Every beat of the drum, every step of the dance, every note of the flute was a prayer made audible. A plea to the gods to keep the sun rising and the world intact. And if you couldn't dance, if you had no rhythm, no coordination, no sense of timing, well, you'd still participate. You'd just shuffle along in the back, hoping the gods appreciated effort over execution. Because in the Aztec Empire the show must go on, literally. The universe depended on it. And then, in 1519, everything changed. Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast, and the Aztec Empire would never be the same. At first, the Aztecs weren't sure what to make of these strange bearded men in metal armour riding giant animals, horses which the Aztecs had never seen before. Some thought they might be gods. Montezuma, the cursed of the Aztec emperor, cautiously welcomed them to Tenochtitlan. Big mistake. Cortés and his men were horrified by the scale of human sacrifice, but they were even more interested in the empire's gold. Tensions escalated. Montezuma was taken hostage. The Spanish massacred Aztec nobles during a religious festival. The city erupted in violence. Montezuma was killed, possibly by his own people, possibly by the Spanish. The Aztecs drove the conquistadors out in what became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But Cortés came back, this time with thousands of indigenous allies who were fed up with Aztec domination. He laid siege to Tenochtitlan, cutting off food and water, and then smallpox arrived. The disease tore through the city, killing more people than the fighting. In 1521, after months of brutal warfare, Tenochtitlan fell. The Aztec Empire was over, and with it, an entire world collapsed. But this collapse didn't happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, painfully, and with a sense of disbelief. The Aztecs had been the unquestioned power of central Mexico for nearly a century. Their capital was a marvel, stone temples rising from the lake, causeways and canals threading the city like veins, markets overflowing with food, fabrics and precious goods. To the Aztecs their world seemed permanent, ordained. Even the gods, they believed, required their empire to endure. The idea that outsiders could destroy something so vast, so sacred, felt impossible, until it wasn't. Cortés understood something critical. The Aztec Empire was powerful, but it was not loved. Many neighbouring city-states had been forced to pay tribute. Food, textiles, precious stones, and most painfully, people to sacrifice. These communities did not forget. When Cortés returned after La Noche Triste, he didn't return alone. He came with tens of thousands of indigenous warriors who saw an opportunity to break the empire's grip. The fall of the Aztecs was not just a clash between two worlds. It was a civil war of resentment, fear, and desperate alliances. Yet even with these shifting loyalties, the Spanish blockade might not have been enough to conquer Tenochtitlan on its own. The city was resilient, and its warriors were fierce. What truly broke the empire was something invisible. Smallpox had arrived with the Europeans, and the Aztecs had no immunity. It spread faster than armies could march. Priests, farmers, soldiers, nobles, no rank was spared. Entire neighbourhoods became silent. Leaders died before they could strategize. The city, once vibrant and loud, filled with the sound of mourning. When Tenochtitlan finally fell, it was not simply a military defeat. It was the end of a way of seeing the world. Temples were torn down and replaced with churches. The great marketplace, once a centre of trade and laughter, became a colonial plaza. Nahuatl, the Aztec language, did not vanish, but it was forced to share space with Spanish. The gods did not disappear, but their temples were buried under new foundations. What had been an empire became a memory, and perhaps the most haunting part is this. The people who lived through it knew they were witnessing the end of something profound. They wrote poems, elegies and laments describing a city once filled with song, now echoing with sorrow. The conquest wasn't just the collapse of a political system, it was the shattering of a world built on centuries of belief, ceremony and cosmic purpose. A world that, for those who lived in it, felt eternal, but history rarely cares about what feels eternal. Sometimes history turns in a single, irreversible moment. So what's left of the Aztec Empire? Ruins, mostly. The Spanish tore down the temples and built their own churches on top. Tenochtitlan became Mexico City, and Lake Texcoco was drained. The pyramids were buried, the gods were forbidden. The language, Nahuatl, survived, but barely. For centuries, the Aztecs were remembered primarily through the lens of Spanish propaganda. Bloodthirsty savages obsessed with sacrifice. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries that scholars began to uncover the full complexity of Aztec civilization. The engineering marvels, the sophisticated agriculture, the art, the poetry, the legal system. The Aztecs were brutal, yes. But they were also brilliant. They built one of the largest cities in the world on an island in the middle of a lake. They created a calendar system so complex it makes your head spin. They turned war, tribute and sacrifice into the foundation of an empire. Today, their legacy is complicated. They were conquerors who terrorized their neighbors. They were artists who created beauty. They were engineers who defied nature. They were believers who thought they were keeping the universe alive. And they were human, flawed, ambitious, terrified and resilient. The Aztec Empire may be gone, but its shadow still stretches across Mexico, woven into the culture, the language, the land itself. And maybe that's the real legacy, not the pyramids or the gold, but the memory of a people who believed so deeply in their purpose that they were willing to sacrifice everything, including themselves, to keep the sun rising. But legacy isn't just about what remains in museums or in the ground. It's about how a civilization continues to shape the identity of those who come after. Walk through Mexico City today, and you can still see the bones of Tenochtitlan beneath your feet. The cathedral in the city centre sits directly atop the ruins of the Templo Mayor. Step outside and you'll hear Nahuatl words everywhere. Words for food, plants, colours and names. The culture didn't die. It adapted, blended, whispered and resurfaced. The chinampas, those floating gardens that once fed millions, still exist in fragments in a place called Xochimilco. The patterns of Aztec art still echo in textiles and murals. The rhythms of their drums reappear in festivals, processions and dances. Even the stories of their gods, Huitzilopochtli, Quetzalcoatl, Tlaloc, still linger in the background of folk tales and regional legends. They were not erased as much as they were layered over. And then there is the myth. The Aztecs have become something larger than history. They are symbols of power, endurance, and tragedy. They represent a civilization that reached remarkable heights, yet was always aware of how fragile existence could be. After all, their entire worldview was built on the belief that the universe was constantly in danger of collapsing, and that human beings were responsible for keeping it alive. Imagine living with that weight every day, believing that your actions, your rituals, your sacrifices literally kept the stars from falling. Modern people often look back and shake their heads at the sacrifices, at the blood, at the relentless duty. But the Aztecs didn't see death as an ending. To them, sacrifice wasn't cruelty. It was meaning. It was participation in the cosmic engine. It was purpose. And perhaps that's why their legacy still resonates today. Because even now, humans crave purpose. We crave the sense that our lives matter in the grand scheme of things. The Aztecs' world may have been violent and terrifying, but it was also coherent. It told them why they were here. Today, when people look back at the Aztecs, they see contradiction. Beauty and brutality, poetry and war, intelligence and fear. But legacy is rarely simple. It is messy, layered, and full of ghosts. The Aztec Empire fell in 1521, but the people never disappeared. Their descendants walk the streets of Mexico. Their words are spoken. Their symbols are carried. Their temples have been dug up again. Their stories retold. And the sun still rises. So what do we do with a story like this? A story of brilliance and blood, of empires built on faith and fear, of gardens floating on lakes and pyramids stretching toward the sun. The Aztec Empire forces us to hold contradictions in our hands. They created beauty that still astonishes us, and they committed violence that still unsettles us. They were capable of extraordinary engineering, poetry, astronomy, and philosophy, and also of rituals that feel alien and brutal to us today. And yet, like every civilization that has ever existed, they were simply human. Human beings trying to understand their place in a vast and uncertain universe. Human beings searching for meaning, for order, for purpose. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not just the end of a kingdom, it was the collapse of a worldview. When Tenochtitlan fell, it shattered more than stone. It shattered a belief that the cosmos was balanced through human action, that the universe required sacrifice to survive, that the people of the Mexica stood at the center of something divine. And yet, in a very real way, the Aztecs never truly disappeared. Their descendants live in Mexico and beyond. Their language threads through everyday speech. Their art, their stories, their gods, their symbols, all continue, reshaped but present. History often tries to simplify, to say something was good or bad, heroic or monstrous, civilized or savage. But the truth is almost always in the middle. The Aztecs remind us that civilizations are complicated. They rise, they change, they fall, they leave echoes. And those echoes don't fade. They vibrate in stone. They linger in language. They ripple in memory. The sun they fought so hard to keep rising is still here, and we're still looking up at it.